I used to tell people I investigated the paranormal for a living, though I never liked the way those words sounded when I said them out loud. They always felt too much like something pulled from a late-night infomercial or one of those television shows where people run through dark houses with flashlights, shouting questions at empty corners. My work was never like that. Most of the time, it involved sitting quietly in someone else's home while they waited downstairs, hoping I could explain why the hallway light turned itself on at 3 in the morning or why their youngest child refused to sleep in her own bed anymore. I listened far more than I spoke, documented whatever I could capture, and sometimes managed to ease whatever had settled into the corners of their lives enough that they could finally breathe again. 15 years passed that way, case after case. Most of them were quiet forms of sadness or grief that had nowhere else to go, so they lingered in the drywall, in the floorboards, in the way a door sometimes creaked open an inch when no one was near it. A few cases were meaner, sharper around the edges. I still carry the scars on my forearms from the time something wrapped invisible fingers around them and squeezed until the skin blistered and peeled, though I never actually saw the hands themselves, only felt the pressure and the searing heat. Another time, something followed me back to my own apartment for nearly a month, methodically turning every mirror in the place so the glass faced the wall, as though it no longer wanted me to see my own reflection. I dealt with both of those incidents the way I dealt with most things, patiently, carefully, without letting panic take over. And I kept going. Until the house on Ortega Way. The email arrived in an inbox I hadn't opened in weeks, buried beneath spam messages and reminders about oil changes I never scheduled. The subject line was nothing more than a string of random numbers followed by the word urgent, nothing that should have caught my attention. But I opened it anyway because sometimes the least promising messages are the ones that matter most. Inside, there was only an address in North Stockton, a request to come after dark if possible, and one short sentence: "They won't stop crying." No name, no phone number, no further explanation. I almost deleted it right then. It sounded exactly like the kind of message exhausted parents send when they've been awake for too many nights in a row, mistaking ordinary house noises for something sinister or perhaps hearing the neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. But the address was in Spanos Park, one of those newer subdivisions where every house matches the next in color and shape, where the lawns are mowed on the same day each week and the streetlights never seem to burn out. People who live in neighborhoods like that don't usually email strangers about ghosts. They call exterminators or therapists first. I figured the worst possible outcome was a wasted evening and maybe a check if they felt guilty enough afterward. So I went alone. The woman who opened the door didn't smile, didn't offer her hand, didn't even say hello. She looked like someone who had forgotten how any of those ordinary gestures worked. Early 30s, perhaps, with her hair pulled back so tightly it tugged at the corners of her eyes, her skin pale and dull beneath the yellow glow of the porch light. She stepped aside to let me enter without a word, and I walked past her into a living room that carried the faint scent of bleach overlaid with something sweeter, like spilled juice that had been wiped up but never completely removed. Toys were arranged neatly in plastic bins along one wall, couch cushions lined up straight, not a single throw pillow out of place. It was the kind of clean that requires constant effort, the kind that suggests someone is trying very hard to maintain control over something that keeps slipping away. She pointed toward the staircase without meeting my eyes, and said the children were downstairs with her now, that they refused to go up after the sun went down. 3 of them, she explained. 8, 6, and 3. And she spoke their names quickly, running the syllables together as though pronouncing them separately might give whatever waited upstairs more power over them. I wrote the names in my notebook out of long habit, even though names almost never proved important once the real work began. I followed her up the stairs. The hallway was short and narrow, carpeted in the same beige that covered most of the floors in houses like this one, with every door closed except the one at the far end. She opened it, and the sound reached me before the light from the room did. Not loud or frantic, just this low, steady, exhausted weeping that seemed to rise from the walls themselves, as though the drywall had learned how to mourn. The bedroom was small for 3 children. 3 twin beds stood pushed against 3 different walls, each covered with a matching blue comforter folded at the corners with hospital precision. A single nightlight shaped like a crescent moon glowed softly near the baseboard, casting pale curves of light across the carpet. There were no posters on the walls, no crayon drawings taped above the headboards, no scattered books or stuffed animals on the pillows, nothing that said children actually lived and played here day to day. The crying didn't pause or change when we stepped inside. It simply continued, low and rhythmic, like a piece of machinery that had been taught to imitate human sorrow without quite understanding why. I set up my usual equipment without much ceremony: a digital audio recorder placed on top of the dresser, an EMF meter set flat on the carpet in the center of the room, a full-spectrum camera mounted on a small tripod, angled to cover the beds and most of the floor space. I sat cross-legged between the two larger beds and waited. The woman lingered in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, arms folded so tightly across her chest that her knuckles showed white. Then she turned and left without speaking. I didn't call her back. Some people cannot stay in the room once the waiting begins. They feel exposed, as though whatever is present can see them more clearly when they stand still. I checked the recorder levels one more time, confirmed the battery was fully charged, then settled in and listened. The crying had a pattern to it. 3 quick, shallow breaths followed by one long, shuddering exhale, repeated over and over, not perfectly synchronized between the 3 voices, but close enough that it felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. For the first hour, the meters stayed quiet. No electromagnetic spikes appeared. No sudden drops in temperature registered. Nothing the equipment was designed to detect. Only the crying continued, patient and unchanging. Around 10:40 it shifted, not in volume but in quality, growing thinner somehow, as though it had drawn closer to the surface of the air. I stood up slowly and walked the perimeter of the room, trailing my fingers along the baseboards, checking the window latch. It was locked, with no drafts coming through the seals, then moved to the closet. The doors were the sliding mirrored kind that reflect the room back at you in pieces. I pulled one panel open. Inside were a few wire hangers swaying slightly from the motion, several small coats still wrapped in dry cleaner plastic, and a clear plastic storage bin filled with folded baby clothes, everything stacked with the same careful precision I had seen downstairs. The crying seemed to press in around me while I stood there, as though it had noticed my attention and responded by leaning closer. I slid the door shut slowly. The mirrors caught my reflection twice before they aligned properly again, and for a moment I thought I saw something move behind my own eyes in the glass. But when I looked again, it was gone. I returned to the center of the room and sat down again. The nightlight flickered once, only once, a quick dimming followed by a return to full brightness. I made a note of the time and later checked the bulb itself. It was seated firmly, with no loose connection and no sign of a short. Around 11:15, the crying divided itself. 3 separate voices emerged now, still layered but no longer perfectly blended. One pitched higher, almost a whine, one softer, more muffled, one so small it was barely audible over the others. I turned the recorder to face the empty beds and began asking the standard questions aloud, keeping my voice calm and even. Who are you? What do you want here? Why won't you let them sleep? There were no answers, no knocks, no sudden gusts of air, just the crying. I asked if they were the children who slept in these beds. The smallest voice, the 3-year-old's, paused for half a second, a tiny hitch in the rhythm, then picked up exactly where it had left off. Then that smallest voice stopped entirely. The other 2 continued for another minute or so before they, too, fell silent. The quiet that followed was so abrupt, it felt like a physical impact. I remained seated, very still, listening to my own breathing become the loudest thing in the room. The air had not grown colder, but it had grown heavier, denser, as though someone had stood directly behind me and let out a long, slow breath against the nape of my neck. I rose carefully and walked to the first bed. The comforter lay perfectly smooth, with no wrinkles and no sign anyone had sat or lain there. The second bed was the same. The third, the smallest one, had a faint indentation in the center of the pillow. Not deep, not dramatic. Just enough to suggest a small head had rested there not long ago. I reached out and placed my palm flat against the sheet. It was warm, not the fading warmth of a body that had recently left, but something steadier, something that had been there long enough to transfer heat into the fabric itself. I drew my hand back. Almost immediately the crying began again, but it was no longer coming from inside the room. It drifted up from downstairs, accompanied by the sound of small, rapid footsteps on the stairs, then the woman's voice cutting through, sharp, frightened, pleading, "No, stay here. Please stay here. Don't go back up." Then the crying stopped again, as suddenly as it had started. I moved quickly down the hallway and down the stairs. The woman was in the living room, the youngest child pressed against her chest, arms wrapped so tightly around him that his face was half hidden in her shirt. The other two sat on the couch, knees pulled up to their chins, expressions blank and distant. The little boy was trembling, his eyes open wide and fixed on a point somewhere above the television. The woman looked at me as though I had caused this. I asked what had happened. She said the children had bolted upstairs without warning. When she caught up to them, they were standing in the hallway just outside their bedroom door, holding hands so hard their knuckles were white, crying so violently they could barely draw breath. The oldest had managed to whisper something about the other kids wanting to play now. She didn't know what it meant. None of them would explain further. I told her we all needed to leave the house immediately. She didn't hesitate or ask questions. She moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had already decided the place was no longer safe. She gathered coats, blankets, a small bag of snacks for the road, car keys from the hook by the door. We went outside together. The night air was cool and still, the streetlights giving off their low, steady hum. She buckled the children into the back of the minivan, told them in a voice that tried to sound normal that we were going to Grandma's house for the night. They didn't ask why. They sat silently, staring straight ahead, the youngest still rubbing the side of his face over and over as though trying to erase the memory of a touch that lingered there. I stayed behind. I told her I needed to check one last thing before I left. She didn't argue or try to convince me to come with them. She simply started the engine and drove away, the interior dome light still on, illuminating 3 small, pale faces looking back through the rear window until the van turned the corner. I went back inside alone. The house felt larger without anyone in it. I climbed the stairs again, stepped into the bedroom. The crying had vanished completely. I stood in the doorway for a long minute, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house settling, furnace cycling on downstairs, refrigerator humming in the kitchen, faint traffic rolling along Hammer Lane in the distance. I walked to the smallest bed. The indentation in the pillow remained. I pressed my palm against it again. The warmth was still there, steady and quiet. I lifted the pillow carefully. Underneath lay a single baby tooth, small, perfectly formed, the root still attached as though it had never been meant to come loose. It had not fallen out naturally. It had been placed there, deliberately. I picked it up between thumb and forefinger. It was warm, the same temperature as the sheet had been, as though it carried some of that same patient heat. I held it in my open palm for what felt like a very long time, feeling the faint living warmth seep slowly into my skin. Then I set it back in the exact spot I had found it, lowered the pillow gently, and stepped away. I left the room, closed the door behind me with a soft click, went downstairs, and sat on the bottom step of the staircase. I called the woman's cell phone. When she answered, I told her not to come back to the house tonight, not even to pick up more clothes. She said she had no intention of returning. I asked, as casually as I could, whether any of the children had lost a tooth recently. She said no. The oldest had mentioned one felt a little loose a few days earlier, but when she checked it yesterday, it was still firmly in place. I didn't tell her what I had found under the pillow. I simply said I would be in touch soon and ended the call. I left the house a little after 2 in the morning, locking the front door with the spare key she had handed me earlier. I drove to the motel on Charter Way, checked in, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tooth resting on my palm, felt again the quiet warmth of it, remembered the precise instant the room had gone silent the moment my fingers brushed the pillow. Around 4, I got up, walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. My reflection looked ordinary. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, same face I had always had. I opened my mouth, counted my teeth twice. They were all still there. All still mine. The next day, I returned to the house in daylight. The woman was waiting outside when I pulled up. The children were still at her mother's place, she said. She unlocked the door and let me in. We climbed the stairs together in silence. The bedroom looked painfully normal under the afternoon sun streaming through the window. Beds made, nightlight off, everything in its place. I walked to the smallest bed and lifted the pillow again. Nothing underneath. No tooth. No lingering warmth. Just ordinary cotton. Cool to the touch. I asked if she had returned to the house at any point during the night. She shook her head. Said she had driven straight to her mother's and hadn't left since. I moved to the closet and opened the storage bin of baby clothes. Everything was still folded exactly as it had been the night before, but resting on top of the stack, placed with the same deliberate care, was another baby tooth. Identical in size and shape to the first one, root still attached, warm the instant my fingertips made contact. I lifted it out and showed it to her. She stared at the small white shape in my hand, then looked up at my face. Her hand rose halfway toward it, trembled, then fell back to her side. She took one step backward, then another. I didn't keep the tooth. I placed it carefully back on top of the folded clothes and closed the bin lid. I told her to pack whatever she and the children absolutely needed, and not to come back inside after that. She asked me what I thought it was. I told her the truth. I didn't know, not in any way that would make sense or bring comfort. I only knew it wasn't safe for them here anymore, and it wasn't safe for anyone who stayed long enough to notice the warmth collecting in small, hidden places. She packed a single suitcase. She left. I remained in the house for another hour, sitting alone in the bedroom with the door open. I waited. Nothing happened. No crying returned. No footsteps sounded in the hallway. No new warmth gathered under the pillows or inside the closet. Just ordinary silence. Before I left, I checked the smallest pillow one final time. Still nothing. But as I stood up to go, the nightlight clicked on by itself. The cord was not plugged in. It dangled loose against the wall, plug resting on the carpet. I unplugged it anyway. Pointless gesture. Coiled the cord neatly and set the light on the dresser. It stayed off after that. I locked the house and left. I never went back inside. I sent the woman a short email report a few days later. Strongly recommended she not return, suggested she speak with a realtor or a different kind of professional if she intended to sell. She never responded. The house went on the market about a month later. It sold quickly. A new family moved in. I never followed up to see how they were doing. I stopped taking cases after that one. Not because I was afraid of what might be waiting in the next house or the next empty room. I stopped because I finally understood that I had spent 15 years looking in the wrong direction for answers. Whatever had been in that bedroom wasn't a ghost in the usual sense. It wasn't angry, wasn't lost, wasn't reaching out for help or trying to deliver a message. It was patient. It waited. It collected small, quiet things. Teeth that hadn't yet fallen, warmth that hadn't yet faded, the precise sound of children crying themselves to sleep, and it kept them. And when I lifted that pillow and felt the heat still living in the fabric, when I held the tooth and felt it share that same warmth with my skin, I realized it had noticed me noticing. Not to harm me, not to frighten me, simply to let me understand that it was there, that it had always been there, and that it would continue to be there long after I walked out the door. I still dream about it sometimes. Not the crying itself, but the moment it stopped. The way the silence rushed in to take its place, thick and warm and intimate, like something alive breathing slowly against my ear. In the dream, I always reach for the pillow again, and every time I lift it, there is a new tooth waiting underneath. Always small, always perfect, always warm, always mine. I don't tell anyone what I used to do for work anymore. When people ask how I make a living, I say I used to work security. It's close enough, and it ends the conversation. I never believed in any of it, not for a single second of my life up until then. Not ghosts wandering around old houses, not demons lurking in the shadows, Not anything that couldn't be broken down and explained with something as simple as a flashlight to check the corners, a multimeter to test for electrical glitches, or even just a quick search online to find the rational cause behind whatever weird noise or feeling someone was describing. I'd grown up watching every episode of those so-called paranormal investigation shows, the ones where supposedly serious adults whisper dramatically into dark, empty hallways and then jump 3 feet in the air at the sound of their own footsteps echoing back at them, and I laughed out loud every single time because it was so obviously staged for ratings. It was pure entertainment to me, nothing more substantial than a bad horror movie, and I treated it that way. When people in my own life tried to share their so-called experiences, stories about cold spots creeping up their spines in the attic, disembodied voices calling their names from rooms they knew were empty, or objects shifting positions when no one was around to touch them, I'd listen with what I thought was polite patience, then start asking the obvious questions that poked holes right through their narratives until their certainty started to crumble and fade away. Most of them would walk off looking a little deflated, like I'd stolen something precious from them without meaning to, but I always told myself I was actually doing them a real favor by forcing them to confront reality instead of hiding behind comforting fairy tales that didn't hold up under any kind of scrutiny. Maybe deep down I was just being an asshole about it all, dismissing their fears without really considering how much those beliefs meant to them. But either way, I was perfectly comfortable living in my bubble of disbelief because it kept everything in my world simple and straightforward, with no room for the unknown to sneak in and complicate things. Then Mitchell showed up in my office one overcast Tuesday afternoon, and everything I thought I knew started to tilt just a little bit off its axis. I'm a therapist by trade, have been for 12 solid years now, dealing mostly with the everyday breakdowns like chronic anxiety that keeps people from leaving their homes, deep-seated depression that turns every day into a gray slog, or the usual midlife crises where someone realizes their choices have led them somewhere they never intended to be. Mitchell's intake form was unusually sparse when I reviewed it before our first session. 42 years old, single with no mention of any past relationships, no current medications listed, and a referral from his primary care doctor because he'd been experiencing panic attacks severe enough to force him to take extended leave from his job as a warehouse supervisor. When he finally sat down in the worn leather chair across from my desk that first time, he looked like so many other clients I'd seen over the years. Eyes shadowed with exhaustion, clothes neat but nothing flashy, hands folded tightly in his lap as if he was consciously trying not to fidget or give away too much too soon. I started with the standard opening questions to ease into things, asking about his daily routines, his support system, any recent changes in his life that might have triggered the attacks. He answered them all quietly and methodically, without much emotion, then leaned forward just a fraction, enough to make the chair creak under his weight. I'm not here because of stress at work or some unresolved issues from my childhood or even my ex-wife leaving me years ago, he said in a voice that was steady but carried an undercurrent of something heavier. I'm here because there's something in my house, and it's been trying to kill me for months now. I kept my expression as neutral as I could manage, the way I've trained myself to do over years of hearing all kinds of unexpected confessions in that room. I've heard variations of this sort of thing before. Clients absolutely convinced that their homes are haunted because the old pipes rattle in the walls during winter, or the foundation shifts with the changing seasons, creating illusions of movement and sound. I nodded encouragingly, asked him to elaborate on what exactly he meant by that, figuring we could unpack it step by step and get to the root of whatever was really going on. He didn't hesitate or look away when he answered. It's a demon, not some vague ghost or leftover energy from whoever lived there before me. Something intelligent, something angry, and something incredibly old that knows exactly what it's doing. It's been there ever since I moved in 3 years ago, right after I bought the place cheap because the previous owners couldn't unload it fast enough. At first, it was just small, annoying things, doors creaking open on their own in the middle of the night, footsteps pacing back and forth overhead, even though I live in a single-story house with no attic space, scratches appearing on the walls that weren't there when I turned out the lights before bed. Then it escalated, got more personal and violent. It talks now, in voices that aren't human. It hurts me physically. It hurts anyone who stays too long, like it's marking its territory or warning them off. I asked if he'd consulted a doctor about the possibility of hallucinations, perhaps brought on by stress or even something environmental like carbon monoxide leaking from an old heater. He shook his head slowly, like he'd anticipated every single one of my doubts and had answers ready for them all. "I know exactly what you're thinking right now," he said without any trace of defensiveness, "and I really don't blame you for it. If I were sitting where you are, I'd be thinking the same things. But I've documented every single incident from the start. Cameras set up in every room, audio recordings running 24/7, detailed journals with timestamps and descriptions. I can show you proof that isn't just my word against logic." I told him that bringing in outside materials like that wasn't strictly necessary for our sessions, that we could begin with some grounding techniques to manage the panic attacks, maybe explore if sleep paralysis or unresolved trauma was playing a role in what he was experiencing. He pulled his phone out of his pocket anyway, thumbed through the gallery with quick, practiced swipes, and handed it across the desk to me without another word. "Watch this one first," he said calmly. "Just this one clip. Then you can decide for yourself if you still think it's all happening inside my head, or if there might be something more to it." The video opened on a living room I'd never laid eyes on before, but it felt oddly familiar in its plainness. A gray sectional couch taking up most of the space, a low coffee table cluttered with remotes and a half-empty water glass. The TV flickering silently in the background with some late-night news program playing. Mitchell was sitting there on the sectional, casually eating takeout from a white foam container, chopsticks in one hand while his phone was propped up on the table, probably scrolling through something mindless to unwind. Nothing out of the ordinary happened for about 30 seconds, long enough that I started to wonder if this was just a test of my patience. Then he flinched suddenly, hard enough that his whole body jerked. He dropped the chopsticks into the container, set it aside, and lifted the hem of his shirt to look down at his stomach. 4 long, parallel scratches appeared across his bare skin, fresh and angry red, with thin lines of blood starting to well up and bead along the edges as if invisible nails had just raked him. He looked straight into the camera lens, his face draining of color, and said in a voice tight with fear, "Leave me alone." A voice responded immediately, not from his mouth, not from any visible speaker or device in the room, not from anywhere I could logically place it. It was deep and layered, like multiple throats speaking at once through a filter of gravel and static. "No." The couch lurched sideways in one violent motion, sliding across the floor like it weighed nothing, and slamming into the far wall with Mitchell still seated on it, his body bouncing from the impact. The video cut off abruptly mid-frame, leaving only the frozen image of the disrupted room. I watched it again right away, pausing at key moments to study the details. Then I watched it a third time, zooming in on the scratches to see if they looked digitally added or too perfect to be real. The wounds appeared genuine, the blood too viscous and random in its flow. The movement of the couch seemed physically authentic, with no visible strings or edits jumping the frame. And that voice, it sent a small shiver through me despite myself. But I reminded myself that videos can be manipulated these days with apps anyone can download. Furniture can be rigged with hidden mechanisms, and audio can be layered in post-production. I handed the phone back across the desk. "That's certainly a compelling piece of footage," I said, choosing my words with care because I didn't want to alienate him right away. "But special effects have become incredibly accessible and sophisticated. Someone could be playing an elaborate prank on you, or perhaps you staged it yourself for reasons I don't understand yet. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just pointing out that it's entirely possible within the realm of technology and trickery." He didn't get angry or defensive like I half expected. He just nodded again, as if my skepticism was exactly the reaction he had prepared for and didn't mind at all. "I figured you'd come back with something along those lines," he said evenly. "That's precisely why I didn't bring just one video or a vague story. I've got years of accumulated evidence here. Hard drives packed with hours of footage from multiple angles, notebooks filled with detailed logs, timestamps that I've cross-referenced with external data like local weather reports, utility meter readings, even my phone's GPS logs to prove no one else was in the house during these events. I'll hand it all over to you right now. Take a full week to go through whatever parts you want. Watch the clips, read the entries. If after all that you still think I'm delusional or fabricating everything, We can end these sessions amicably, and I'll find another therapist who might be more open-minded. But if even a small sliver of doubt creeps in for you, if you start to wonder whether there might be something inexplicable at play, then maybe you can actually help me figure out how to make it stop. I should have declined the offer outright. As a therapist, I don't typically take home piles of client-generated evidence like it's some kind of homework assignment to grade. But that initial video had planted a small, cold weight somewhere in my chest, a nagging sensation that refused to dissipate no matter how many rational explanations I ran through in my mind. I found myself nodding, telling him we had a deal, and watching as he promised to drop off the materials the very next day. The following afternoon, he arrived at my office with 2 external hard drives tucked under one arm and a thick stack of spiral notebooks secured with heavy rubber bands, the kind that leave red marks on your fingers if you snap them wrong. He set them down on the side table next to my desk, like they were nothing more than routine paperwork or a forgotten library book. "This isn't the complete collection," he said with a faint, weary smile. "But it's more than enough to get the point across. If this doesn't shift your perspective at least a little, then I don't think anything ever will." That night, after I'd finished my last session and locked up the office, I took everything home to my quiet apartment on the east side of town, plugged the first drive into my laptop while sitting on the couch with the living room lights dimmed low, opened the corresponding notebook to the first dated entry, and started right at the beginning without any further delay. The early files were relatively tame compared to what came later, objects like mugs or books sliding slowly across kitchen counters without any apparent cause, doors slamming shut in empty rooms with enough force to rattle the frames, footsteps pacing methodically back and forth in deserted hallways where no one could possibly be walking. Things that, on their own, could easily be attributed to hidden wires, strategically placed magnets, or even natural drafts from poorly sealed windows. But the timestamps were impeccably consistent across multiple cameras. The angles varied in ways that didn't suggest suspicious repetition or editing cuts, and Mitchell's reactions in the footage looked genuinely unscripted. Startled flinches, muttered curses under his breath, a growing tension in his posture that built over time. Then the videos took a darker turn, escalating in ways that made it harder to dismiss them outright. Scratches materializing on his arms and torso while he lay sleeping in bed. 3 long, parallel lines at a time, appearing as if drawn by invisible fingers with no one else visible in the frame. Low, guttural growls emanating from the guest bedroom when the door was clearly closed and bolted from the outside. A leather-bound Bible left on the coffee table suddenly catching fire without any ignition source nearby, the pages curling and blackening while the cover remained inexplicably untouched and cool. In one particularly jarring clip, he was thrown backward into a living room wall with enough violence that the drywall behind him cracked in a spiderweb pattern, his body crumpling to the floor afterward without any visible wires or mechanical aids to explain the force. No obvious edits jumped out at me, just the raw impact and his pained groan as he struggled to get up. I kept watching long into the night because stopping would have felt like conceding ground to the uncertainty that was starting to build inside me. The notebook entries were meticulous to the point of obsession, precise dates and times, detailed descriptions of each event, sometimes with faded Polaroid photos taped directly to the pages showing before and after shots of damaged walls or bruised skin. He noted every variable he could control, when he'd replaced camera batteries to rule out power failures, when he'd invited skeptical friends over to witness the activity firsthand and corroborate his accounts, when the incident seemed to spike after personal arguments or periods of high stress in his life. It was all so thorough, so relentlessly documented, that it began to wear down my initial resistance. Then I reached the possession videos, and everything shifted from unsettling to something far more profound and disturbing. In the worst one of the bunch, Mitchell was sitting cross-legged on the bare living room floor late at night, knees drawn up close to his chest, rocking back and forth slightly as if trying to comfort himself through whatever was building in the air around him. His head snapped up toward the camera without warning, his eyes looking profoundly wrong. Not rolled back into his skull or glazed over in a trance, just fundamentally altered in a way that made them seem like they belonged to someone else entirely. He opened his mouth wide, and words poured out in rapid Latin, guttural and forceful, with multiple voices overlapping inside his single throat like a demonic choir recorded in reverse and played at varying speeds. The phrases weren't perfectly enunciated. I don't speak Latin fluently, just bits from college electives, but I recognized enough scattered words to know they weren't random gibberish or made-up sounds. When the clip finally ended after what felt like an eternity, he collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, a thin trickle of blood dripping from his nostril onto the carpet below. I shut the laptop lid with more force than I intended. Sat there in the sudden dark of my living room for what must have been half an hour, staring at the blank screen while my mind raced through every possible explanation I could grasp at. My apartment felt unnaturally quiet after that, the usual hum of the fridge in the kitchen sounding distant and muffled. I eventually dragged myself to bed, but left the bedside lamp on, something I hadn't done since I was a kid, afraid of monsters under the mattress. Sleep came in broken fragments that night, interrupted repeatedly by the echo of that layered voice in my head, leaving me more exhausted than rested by morning. I told myself in the daylight that it had to be exhaustion playing tricks on me, or the power of suggestion amplified by the late hour, or even just exceptionally skilled editing designed to provoke exactly that kind of reaction. But the doubt had taken firm root by then, a quiet nagging that wouldn't let go no matter how I tried to rationalize it away. I pushed through the rest of the materials over the next few days, watching during lunch breaks or late evenings when I couldn't bring myself to do anything else. More instances of violence unfolded on the screen, household objects like lamps or books being hurled at him from off-frame with pinpoint accuracy, furniture upending itself in empty rooms as if kicked by an invisible boot, his body being lifted off the ground and twisted midair like a rag being wrung out to dry, limbs bending at angles that made my own joints ache in sympathy. One video in particular stood out for its raw brutality. Mitchell and a woman who looked like a casual date sat on the couch together, starting with soft kisses and gentle touches that seemed normal enough at first glance. Then, without any transition or warning, their movements turned savage. They clawed at each other's skin with nails that drew blood, bit into shoulders and necks hard enough to leave deep marks, tore at clothing and hair until both were left bleeding and sobbing in a tangled heap. The footage didn't cut away or fade out. It just kept rolling relentlessly until they finally lay still, breathing raggedly, bodies slick with red smears. The timestamp at the bottom showed the entire sequence had lasted 11 agonizing minutes, and by the end, I felt a nausea rising that had nothing to do with the visuals alone. When I'd finally gone through every last file and page, I sat back and stared at the empty screen, not knowing exactly what I believed anymore. I only knew with certainty that I couldn't dismiss the entirety of it as fabrication or delusion. Not completely, not without feeling like I was willfully ignoring evidence that defied easy categorization. At our next scheduled session a few days later, I told him straight out that I'd reviewed all of it thoroughly, that certain parts were simply impossible to explain through any rational lens I could apply, that I was committed to helping him navigate whatever this was. But first, to be absolutely certain in my own mind, I needed to experience it firsthand, in the house itself. Completely off the record, no notes, no recordings, just me observing in real time. He stared at me across the desk for a long, uncomfortable stretch of time, his expression unreadable. "I've lost people that way before," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets. Friends who insisted on staying over to see for themselves. Dates who thought it was exciting at first. Even family members who came to intervene and ended up needing help themselves. It doesn't just stay confined to me or the house. It follows sometimes. It attaches itself to new hosts like a parasite looking for fresh ground. I told him I fully understood the risks he was describing, that I needed this step to be 100% sure before I could provide any meaningful treatment or guidance. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling slowly, like he was releasing something pent up. "I tried to warn you off from the start. You really still want to go through with this?" I said yes, without hesitation. That same night I drove out to his address under a sky heavy with clouds, no stars visible to light the way. The house was a modest, single-story ranch in a worn-down neighborhood on the outskirts of Murata, the kind of place where the paint peels in strips along the trim, and the yard grows patchy and overgrown but never quite wild enough to draw complaints from the neighbors. Mitchell met me on the front porch before I even made it up the cracked concrete steps, his silhouette outlined by the dim yellow light spilling from the open door behind him. "Last chance to back out," he said, his tone almost pleading now. "You can turn around right here, drive home, and I won't think any less of you for it. We can pretend this conversation never happened." I shook my head firmly. "I have to know for sure. I can't help you otherwise." He sighed, turned back to the door, and held it open wider. "Come on in, then." I stepped across the threshold and looked around the interior. The living room matched the videos down to the smallest details. Same gray sectional pushed against the wall, same low coffee table with its familiar clutter, same overall layout that now felt eerily intimate, despite me never having set foot there before. It was disorienting, like walking into a movie set I'd studied frame by frame. Mitchell closed the door softly behind us and turned the deadbolt with a decisive click that echoed in the quiet space. "Mitchell?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as a faint unease started to build. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice had changed, lower, rougher, laced with a fatigue that bordered on resignation. "I gave you every possible out I could think of," he said, turning to face me fully. "You wouldn't take a single one of them. People like you are always the same in the end. You put all your faith in science and facts and tidy explanations, but when something comes along that doesn't fit neatly into your perfect little narrative, you dismiss it outright as bullshit or delusion. Then, when you have no choice but to start accepting it might be real, you treat it like some fascinating new puzzle to solve, like a game you can win with enough persistence. And I can assure you, this isn't a game anyone wins." The lights in the room began to flicker erratically, casting stuttering shadows across the walls. The floor beneath my feet trembled once, hard enough to rattle the coffee table and send the water glass tipping over. A massive shadow detached itself from the ceiling overhead, black and shapeless, moving with unnatural speed. It slammed into Mitchell square in the chest, like a freight train made of darkness. He went down hard, skidding backward across the carpet until he hit the baseboard with a thud. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the shaking ceased, and the lights steadied themselves back to normal. I lunged toward the door, my hand outstretched for the deadbolt. Something stopped me cold. The air itself turned solid and unyielding, pressing against my body like an invisible wall and holding me frozen in place. I couldn't move forward, couldn't even twist away. My breathing came in short, panicked bursts. A warm wetness spread down my leg. I'd pissed myself without realizing it until that moment. The humiliation mixed with terror in a way that made everything feel even more surreal. "Please," I managed to gasp out. "God, please help me." A chorus of voices answered from the floor where Mitchell still lay motionless, overlapping and inhuman, like echoes from a bottomless well. "God only visits believers." Mitchell rose slowly to his feet, his movements jerky and unnatural. He smiled at me, but it wasn't his smile anymore. It was something else wearing his face like a poorly fitted mask, eyes gleaming with a malice that hadn't been there before. The shadow peeled away from his form, coalescing into a taller, more defined shape behind him, towering, clawed, with edges that bled into the surrounding dimness like ink in water. It reached out with one massive hand, fingers tipped in points that glinted dully, grabbed Mitchell by the throat in a vice grip, lifted him effortlessly off the ground, and hurled him bodily into the far wall. The impact made a sickening thud, drywall caving inward, a spray of blood painting the surface in dark streaks. Mitchell's body slumped to the floor and didn't move again, didn't even twitch. The thing turned its attention to me fully. I don't remember the rest with perfect clarity. Fragments of pressure crushing down on my chest, cold seeping into my bones like winter rain, blackness swallowing everything until there was nothing left to see or feel. I woke up sometime later in my own bed back at the apartment, sheets twisted around my legs in knots, mouth dry and tasting like metal, sunlight filtering through the half-closed blinds as if it were any ordinary morning. I had no idea how I'd gotten there, no memory of driving home or unlocking the door, but a dreadful certainty settled over me like a shroud. I hadn't come back alone. I feel it sometimes now, a persistent weight hovering at the edge of the room when I turn off the lights for the night. A faint breath brushing against the back of my neck when I'm standing alone in the shower with the water running hot. A whisper echoing in the empty hallway that sounds disturbingly like my own voice, murmuring things I would never think to say out loud, things that twist my stomach into knots. I still go to work every day, still sit in that same chair across from people who are hurting in ways I used to think I understood. I listen to their stories without interruption. I nod at the right moments. I prescribe coping strategies or referrals when I can. But I don't laugh at the strange accounts anymore, no matter how outlandish they sound on the surface. And every single night before I try to sleep, I check the locks on the doors and windows. Not because I genuinely believe they'll keep it out if it decides to come closer. Because I know without a shadow of doubt that they won't. I've been able to see and hear the dead since I was 8 years old, and for most of my childhood and early adulthood, the spirits who crossed my path were quiet about their intentions, content to linger just long enough to deliver whatever small, unfinished piece of business still tethered them here before they drifted away again into whatever came next. They appeared in the ordinary corners of everyday life, sitting motionless on the edge of my bed at night, standing silently just beyond doorways watching me with eyes that held no malice but also no urgency, hovering near the foot of the stairs in the house where I grew up, and usually all they required was to be acknowledged, to have someone look directly at them and listen while they spoke their name, their regret, their final message for a living relative who had never quite heard them the first time around. Sometimes the requests were painfully simple. Tell my sister I forgave her for the argument we never resolved, or let my husband know the insurance papers are in the blue folder behind the encyclopedia set on the top shelf. Other times they carried warnings, though those warnings were almost always narrow and personal. Don't drive on that stretch of highway after midnight because the bridge is going to ice over unexpectedly. Don't accept the ride from the man in the red pickup who parks near the gas station on Fridays. Stay away from the riverbank after dusk because the current is stronger than it looks and it remembers faces. I passed along what felt safe to pass along, kept the rest locked inside when telling the truth would have made people look at me like I was unstable, or worse, and over time I learned to live with the constant low hum of the unseen world brushing against the edges of my own. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had turned that strange ability into something that resembled a profession. Freelance paranormal investigations, discreet consultations for families who couldn't explain the footsteps in empty hallways, or the child who refused to sleep in her own room, the occasional quiet assist to law enforcement on cold cases where they had run out of conventional leads and were willing to try anything, even someone who claimed he could ask the dead for directions. I never advertised my services. People found me through word of mouth, through desperate late-night internet searches, through friends who knew someone who swore I had helped once before. I never charged much, never promised miracles, and never brought any of it home if I could help it. None of the dead had ever spoken to me the way this one did, and none had ever left marks that lingered into daylight. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening in late March, the kind of soft spring night when the air still carried a faint chill but promised warmth soon. Our son, 6 years old then, all sharp elbows and endless curiosity, had finally worn himself out after spending the entire afternoon tearing around the backyard in his cape, chasing imaginary villains and declaring victory over every bush and tree he could reach. He'd skipped dinner entirely in favor of collapsing on the living room couch for a Justice League marathon, bundled under his Batman blanket with a bowl of goldfish crackers balanced on his chest, eyes already heavy before the opening credits finished rolling. Mary and I sat at the kitchen table across from each other in the warm yellow light of the overhead fixture, plates of her latest culinary invention in front of us. What she had proudly named Tex-Mex smashed potatoes, a gloriously messy combination of russet potatoes mashed with chorizo, sharp cheddar, green onions, jalapenos, and enough smoked paprika to make your eyes water if you breathed in too deeply while eating. She took a careful first bite, closed her eyes for a long second as the flavors hit. then looked across at me with that small, expectant smile she saves for moments when she knows she's created something special. "Admit it," she said around the mouthful, pointing her fork at me like a prosecutor making her closing argument. "These are the single best thing I have ever put on a plate. No contest." I smiled back, even though in the back of my mind I was already thinking how much I still preferred her jambalaya on nights when the wind came cold off the delta. "They're incredible," I told her honestly. "You win this round, hands down." She beamed, the kind of unguarded happiness that still caught me off guard after all these years, and we ate in the comfortable quiet that settles between people who have learned how to share silence without it feeling empty. The house was peaceful around us, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, the distant murmur of cartoon dialogue drifting from the living room, the soft clink of forks against plates. Then it came. "Warn them." The words didn't arrive through ordinary sound. They unfolded inside my skull, low and resonant, as though someone had leaned in close and spoken directly against the soft tissue of my brain. The voice carried no accent I could place, no recognizable timbre, yet every syllable was perfectly distinct, deliberate, impossible to mistake for a stray thought or the echo of fatigue. I froze with my fork suspended halfway between the plate and my mouth, a small mound of potato cooling on the tines while my pulse suddenly felt too loud in my ears. I have no history of auditory hallucinations, never have, not even in the worst stretches of sleep deprivation after long investigations or the occasional all-nighter when a case wouldn't let me rest. At almost 30, I understood that if some form of schizophrenia or a late-emerging neurological condition was going to announce itself, there would have been earlier, subtler signs. Whispers at the very edge of hearing, fleeting visual distortions, creeping paranoia that built gradually over months. This was none of those things. This was a voice, clear and commanding, using language I understood instantly, even though it arrived without any familiar human quality. For a single heartbeat, I wondered if a spirit had crossed the threshold into our home without my noticing, but the kitchen air didn't carry the usual telltale heaviness. No sudden cold spot blooming around my chair. No shift in pressure that made my ears pop. No faint scent of old perfume or wet earth that sometimes accompanied the dead when they drew near. Just the voice, and the after echo of it ringing inside my head like a struck bell. I set the fork down slowly, careful not to let the metal clatter against the plate. Mary glanced up from her own food, eyebrows lifting in mild concern. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like someone just walked over your grave." "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "Just zoned out for a second. Long day." She studied me a moment longer, the way she does when she senses I'm holding something back, then shrugged and returned to her potatoes. I didn't mention the voice. After the ride-along with that priest in Massachusetts 5 years earlier, after watching a woman thrash on the floor of a dim rectory while something ancient spoke through her in a language that made the room reek of sulfur and burnt hair, Mary had drawn a firm, non-negotiable line. No more bringing the work home. No more waking her at 3 in the morning because I'd come in smelling of old plaster and candle wax and couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me through the door. She had made it clear in no uncertain terms. If the paranormal ever crossed our threshold again in a way she could feel, we would pack up and leave before the sun rose. I respected that boundary. I loved her for drawing it. So I swallowed the words and kept eating, even though the food suddenly tasted like nothing at all. We finished dinner, cleaned the kitchen together in our usual rhythm, went to bed. I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow, lazy circles above us, listening to the house breathe, the soft tick of the baseboard heater kicking on and off, the occasional creak from the attic as the temperature shifted, Mary's steady breathing beside me as she slipped into sleep. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The dream arrived fast and deep, without preamble. I stood on the surface of the ocean at night. Black water stretched endlessly in every direction, moonless except for a thin silver crescent hanging high overhead that cast only the faintest metallic sheen across the restless swells. The sea moved in slow, heavy rolls that should have dragged me under and drowned me in seconds, yet my feet remained steady, planted as if the water had hardened into packed earth beneath me. I didn't sink. I stood. A woman appeared perhaps 20 feet away, also standing on the surface, untouched by the waves that broke and foamed around her ankles without ever wetting the hem of her simple white shift. She was heavily pregnant, her belly round and taut beneath the clinging fabric. Long dark hair flowed past her waist, moving with a slow muscular undulation that had nothing to do with wind or current. Each strand seemed alive, coiling and reaching independently like tiny limbs testing the air. Her skin glistened under the thin moonlight, slick and faintly iridescent, the way an eel's does when it slides through shallow dock water at night. As she drew closer, I saw her face clearly. Heart-shaped lips, high sharp cheekbones, bright green eyes that caught and held the crescent light like polished sea glass. She was beautiful in a way that made something deep in my chest ache with longing and dread at the same time, unearthly and perfect and utterly wrong. Then she opened her mouth. Rows of needle-sharp teeth lined the inside, jagged and overlapping like the inside of a deep-sea trap. Her jaw unhinged slowly, stretching wider than any human bone structure could allow, revealing a dark gullet that seemed to descend forever into nothing. Long limbs, too many, too thin, too flexible, unfurled from behind her back and reached for me with blinding speed. They wrapped around my arms, cold and slick as kelp, yanking me forward until I fell face down onto a hard, shifting surface that pulsed faintly beneath me. The water I had been standing on was no longer water. It was alive. I looked down through the clear shallows and saw it. An immense shape coiling into the black abyss below, tentacles branching outward in every direction, impossibly vast, no beginning or end visible, only endless darkness folding into more darkness. The creature the woman stood upon. The thing that carried her across the ocean like a living crown. Thunder rolled, not from the sky but through my ribcage, a deep vibration that rattled my teeth and squeezed my lungs. The woman snapped her mouth shut inches from my face. The limbs released me. Warn them! The scream erupted inside my own head this time, loud enough to shatter the dream and hurl me back into waking. I sat up gasping, sheets drenched with sweat. The sharp salt smell of the ocean thick in my nostrils and clinging to my skin like I'd been pulled from the surf. Mary slept undisturbed beside me, one arm flung across the pillow. I slipped out of bed quietly, padded to the bathroom, turned on the shower as hot as the valve would allow. Standing under the scalding spray, I tried to scrub the dream away, letting the water pound against my shoulders until my skin turned red. My left forearm throbbed dully. I looked down. A bruise had already bloomed. 2 perfect looping bands of deep purple and black wrapping around the forearm exactly where those slick limbs had gripped me in the dream. The marks were fresh, tender to the touch, the skin slightly raised as though the pressure had only just released. I stared at them for a long time, water streaming over the discoloration, feeling the ache deepen with every heartbeat. Had it followed me out of sleep? Or had sleep followed me into the waking world? I turned off the water, stepped out onto the bath mat. The bathroom was thick with steam, yet the air felt strangely cold against my dripping skin, raising gooseflesh along my arms and legs. I shivered, reached for a towel, wiped the condensation from the mirror with my forearm. For half a second she was there, reflected just behind me, smiling with that impossibly wide mouth full of teeth, tentacles reaching again. This time they closed around my throat. I felt the cold, slimy pressure, the faint sting of salt water burning against my skin like a paper cut dipped in brine. I squeezed my eyes shut, braced for the pull that would drag me down. Nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the mirror showed only me, pale, dripping, eyes wide and bloodshot. But when I touched my throat, my fingers came away slick with seawater that smelled faintly of kelp and iron. I dressed with shaking hands, made coffee in the dark kitchen, sat at the computer in the living room with only the blue glow of the screen for light. I pulled up every news site I could think of, scrolled through weather maps, emergency alerts, breaking headlines. Nothing new jumped out. The pandemic was still grinding its slow, relentless course across the globe, but no sudden explosive spikes, no new variants tearing through populations overnight. No tsunamis triggered by distant quakes, no hurricanes forming out of season in the Pacific, no asteroids flagged by observatories as immediate threats. I searched for anything Anything at all that might require a warning on a scale large enough to justify what I had felt, and found only the same weary repetition of headlines we had been reading for months. Infection rates plateauing in some regions, rising in others, supply chain delays, vaccine distribution struggles, the quiet hope that warmer weather might slow transmission again. Mary woke a few hours later, came into the kitchen in her robe with her hair mussed from sleep and her eyes still heavy. I told her about the dream, carefully editing out the bruise and the voice at dinner, framing it as nothing more than a vivid nightmare brought on by too much late-night footage review. She laughed softly, the sound warm and ordinary in the morning light. "Sounds like you've been mixing Lovecraft with Greek mythology again," she said, pouring herself coffee. "Or maybe you ate too much chorizo before bed and your stomach staged a revolt in your subconscious." I forced a smile, tugged my sleeve down to cover the mark that was now darkening toward black. Our son burst in then, Superman cape tied crookedly around his shoulders, yelling, "I'll save you, Daddy," before launching himself into my lap for a fierce hug. I held him tight, breathing in the clean smell of his shampoo and the faint sweetness of the orange juice he'd already spilled on his pajamas, and told him he was exactly what I needed right then. The day passed in ordinary rhythm, the comforting routine of family life that usually grounded me when the work got too heavy. I reviewed footage from a recent investigation a colleague had sent, shadows moving unnaturally in an empty upstairs hallway of an abandoned farmhouse, nothing groundbreaking but enough to keep my mind occupied. I helped Mary clean the kitchen, scrubbing pans side by side while she hummed off-key show tunes from the radio. I played superheroes in the backyard until my knees ached and my son declared me officially defeated by his superior heat vision. I checked the news again and again, refreshing pages obsessively, waiting for something to match the urgency still thrumming under my skin. Every time the anxiety started to ebb, something pressed on the bruise. Sometimes a phantom touch like cold fingers tracing the marks. Sometimes just the memory of those slick limbs wrapping tight, and the dread rushed back in, cold and insistent. That night our son asked me to put him to bed. I read Pete the Cat twice through, doing all the silly voices he loved, kissed his forehead, switched off the lamp. As I reached the doorway he stirred, half asleep, murmuring something too soft to catch. "Warn them." The voice was deeper this time, rougher, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. My son was still curled under the blanket, breathing slow and even, eyes closed, small hands tucked beneath his cheek. No sign he had spoken. No sign he had moved at all. I rubbed the bruise hard enough to make fresh pain bloom along the marks. Hair stood up on my arms and the back of my neck. I found Mary in the kitchen, making peppermint tea, the TV murmuring low in the background. The news anchor was talking about an unexpected side effect of the global lockdowns, cleaner canals in Venice where the water had turned clear enough for fish to return, dolphins swimming through places they hadn't been seen in decades. Mary glanced over from the stove. "I read online that some scientists think species we thought were extinct might come back because of this," she said, stirring honey into her mug. "No hunting, no boats churning up the sediment, no pollution for a while. Nature's getting a breather." I stared at the screen, the images of sleek gray bodies cutting through turquoise water. The woman from the dream flashed in my mind, her slick skin, her writhing hair, the vast thing beneath the waves carrying her forward. "Yes," I said quietly. "You should warn them." My head snapped toward her. For a single heartbeat, she wasn't Mary anymore. She was waterlogged, skin sloughing off in pale sheets that drifted down like wet paper, mouth gaping open as black water poured out in a steady, choking stream. The smell hit me, rotting vegetation, brine, decay so thick it stung my eyes and coated the back of my throat. Her arms reached, trembling and desperate, as though touching me would anchor her long enough to keep from dissolving completely into the puddle forming at her feet. I backed away until my spine hit the refrigerator door, heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "About what?" I asked, voice cracking. "What do I need to warn them about?" She blinked, became Mary again, teapot in hand, eyebrows raised in concern. "I said you should look it up," she repeated gently. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I rubbed my eyes hard with the heels of my hands. Yeah, the dream just stuck with me more than I thought it would. I tried to laugh it off. It came out wrong, more bark than chuckle. I slapped my palms against my thighs and stood abruptly. Okay, I think I'm gonna go lie down. She watched me go, worry flickering across her face, but she only nodded. I'll be in soon. Peppermint tea and murder mysteries first. If you need me, I'm right here. I kissed her cheek, tasting nothing but ordinary skin and the faint sweetness of honey, and went to bed, hoping sleep would bring answers instead of more questions. The second dream was fire instead of water. I stood on a narrow shelf of black volcanic rock above a river of lava, heat rising in shimmering waves that stung my eyes and cracked my lips within seconds. Ash drifted like gray snow, settling on my shoulders and hair. A woman waited ahead of me, moving closer on a platform of molten stone that glowed dull red beneath her feet. Her hair writhed around her like living vines, grasping at her arms, her shoulders, reaching outward in slow, deliberate coils. Her skin was segmented exoskeleton, cracked and glowing orange at every joint like cooling magma, plates shifting with each step. Golden eyes burned in her face, bright enough to hurt to look at directly. Pregnant again, belly swollen beneath the armored carapace. Beneath us, something enormous stirred in the lava, coiling, rising, spitting sparks and molten droplets into the air that hissed and cooled mid-flight. She opened her mouth. Fangs angled in every direction, lips pulling back to reveal a furnace inside, fire dancing on her tongue and deep in her throat. Warn them. What about? I shouted over the roar of molten rock and rushing heat. Tell me what it means. She drew nearer. The heat seared my skin, blistering almost instantly. I begged myself not to wake up, pressed forward despite every instinct screaming to run, to jump into the lava and end it quickly rather than let her reach me. Her mouth widened further. Inside her throat I saw eyes, human eyes, blackened and cracked like burnt wood, staring out in absolute terror. Warn them! Warn them! Warn them! The scream tore through me, not hers but his, the man trapped inside her, his voice raw with panic. I woke up on the bedroom floor, Mary gripping my shoulders and shaking me hard, our son standing in the corner with tears streaming down his face, staring at me like I was a stranger. You were screaming, Mary said, voice trembling. Not your voice, something else entirely. I asked what I'd said. She wouldn't tell me at first. All day she avoided the question, saying she didn't want me to feel pressured to repeat it. Didn't want me to sound crazy if the words came out of my mouth again in daylight. Late that afternoon, after many failed attempts to get her to open up, she handed me a folded piece of paper she had found on the nightstand. I opened it. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing it, no recollection of getting out of bed or finding a pen. The words were these: We have warned you time and time again, and you have not listened. We have warned you with fire, with water, with pestilence, with storms. You have polluted our air and made it impossible for us to reach our scribes. You have left the poor to suffer in your pollution as you protect yourself and lie to them saying they should be calm. You have created bombs to strike fear into your enemies. You have fought wars and killed to keep yourself in positions of power. Every day you force those with no options to kill the innocent in the name of power. This is a warning to you, the ones in power, the ones that hold all of the cards and use them to cause others to submit. Heed our warning. This virus that is ravaging you is only the beginning. We know our scribes will hear us now. They will tell you to stop letting greed and arrogance cause you to ruin the lives of those you see as beneath you. They will tell you to stop fighting wars in the name of power. They will tell you to stop polluting the earth in the name of riches. Heed their warning. For the next time, we will not let you stay safely in your palaces while the poor and downtrodden suffer. We will not allow you to use the least of you to keep your precious economy running as you hide yourself away. We will come for you. We will destroy you. Your God created us. He gave us the power to do these things to you who do evil in His name. He gave the power to smite the ones that call themselves good and hide themselves away when the lowly suffer. He will not help you when you send Him your prayers. Your time is almost up. We are the ancient ones. We are what you call hell. We are on earth. You are the evil that has brought this plague upon you. I read it twice. then folded the paper carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk beneath old tax forms and expired warranties. I haven't opened it since. The bruise on my arm faded over the next week, turning from black to sickly yellow-green before disappearing entirely, but the dreams didn't stop. Different faces each time, earth cracked open and swallowing cities, wind tearing roofs from houses, plague spreading through crowded streets, but the message remained the same. Warn them. And every time I woke, gasping and soaked, I felt the weight of something older than human watching from places I couldn't see, patient and unhurried. I haven't told anyone what I wrote that night. Not Mary, who still watches me sometimes with quiet worry when she thinks I'm not looking. Not my son, who has started asking why Daddy looks sad when he thinks no one is paying attention. Not the investigators who still call asking for help on cases that have gone cold or houses that feel wrong. I keep waiting for the next warning to come clearer, for the ancient ones to tell me exactly who to speak to, exactly what words to use, exactly how loud I need to shout before someone finally listens. So far they haven't. They just keep repeating the same thing, night after night, bruise or no bruise, dream or waking whisper. And every night I lie awake wondering how much longer they'll wait before they stop asking and start acting, before the warnings turn into something none of us can ignore. I never used to believe in any of it. Not even a little. Not until that night when everything I thought I understood about the ordinary world cracked open and let something impossible slip through. Not ghosts lingering in old houses or abandoned buildings. Not demons whispering from the shadows of empty rooms. Not anything supernatural that couldn't be explained away with a rational cause like bad wiring making lights flicker on and off or wind rattling loose shutters to mimic footsteps in the dark. I'd watched enough late-night documentaries on channels that specialized in the paranormal, and I'd scrolled through endless Reddit threads when I couldn't sleep, always spotting the same predictable pattern. Someone checks into a rundown motel off a quiet road. Strange things start happening that they can't quite rationalize. They leave the next morning convinced they've brushed against something from the other side, and the comments split right down the middle, half calling it complete bullshit, while the other half piles on with their own stories to validate it. I always landed squarely in the bullshit camp, shaking my head at how quickly people let their imaginations run wild after a long drive or a few too many drinks from a roadside bar. My girlfriend Emily and I used to laugh about those posts together, usually sprawled on the couch with our laptops open, planning our next spontaneous road trip while we mocked the over-the-top accounts. We both loved the freedom of getting in the car and driving until the playlist ran out, stopping at greasy diners with bottomless coffee and neon signs that hadn't been updated since the 80s, chasing that feeling that the world could stretch on forever if we just kept moving. Flying always made her anxious, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. So when we got the invitation to her cousin's wedding up in New Brunswick, we decided to turn it into a proper journey by taking the scenic route through Maine, packing the car with snacks, playlists, and the kind of optimism that makes you think nothing bad can happen when you're together. The rain started the moment we left Massachusetts, not a polite summer shower that might pass after a few miles, but a relentless, hammering downpour that turned the pavement into slick rivers and made every sweep of the windshield wipers feel like a losing battle against the sky. We were supposed to crash for the night with an old college friend in Portland right on the coast, but that morning he called with bad news. His mom had taken a sudden turn in New York, so he had to head south to be with her over the weekend. No big deal, we told ourselves, shaking it off as one of those unexpected detours that come with any trip worth taking. We figured we could easily find another place to stop, maybe a cozy bed and breakfast or a chain hotel with reliable Wi-Fi and a hot breakfast. The GPS kept rerouting us around flooded back roads and construction zones that appeared out of nowhere, and by the time the sky had darkened to the dull gray of wet concrete with no sign of letting up, we were both exhausted from the constant focus on the slick road ahead, hungry for something more substantial than gas station snacks, and more than ready to pull over anywhere that promised a dry bed and a hot shower to wash away the damp chill that had settled deep into our bones. We spotted the sign for the lodge just as the last hints of daylight were fading behind the heavy clouds, the neon letters flickering weakly through the sheets of rain, like the sign itself was having second thoughts about staying lit in such miserable weather. The place sat tucked off a quiet stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick stands of pine trees that swayed and groaned in the wind, a U-shaped courtyard of single-story units with peeling white paint that had probably been fresh sometime in the 70s and half, the windows boarded up with weathered plywood that looked like it had been nailed in place for decades. The parking lot stretched out empty except for a couple of rusted-out pickup trucks parked at odd angles, their tires flat and weeds pushing up through the cracks in the asphalt around them, as if they hadn't moved in years. I pulled in anyway, because the next possible stop was a long way off, and Emily's eyes were starting to glaze over from the endless rhythm of the wipers and the same gray highway stretching ahead. "Is this place even open?" she asked, leaning forward to peer through the streaked passenger window, her voice carrying that familiar edge of uncertainty she gets when something feels off, but she doesn't want to overreact just yet. I pointed toward the small office at the far end of the row. A neon sign buzzed faintly above the door. The lodge. Through the dirty, rain-smeared window, I could make out an old woman sitting rigidly behind a cluttered desk, motionless as a mannequin, her gaze fixed directly on us as we rolled to a stop in the empty lot. I got out into the pouring rain without another word. Lightning cracked sharply overhead, illuminating the courtyard in brief, stark flashes as I jogged across the broken asphalt, water already pooling in the low spots and soaking straight through my sneakers in icy bursts. The office smelled strongly like stale cigarettes mixed with the musty tang of mothballs when I pushed the creaky door open, the bell above it giving a weak, half-hearted jingle that barely carried over the storm outside. The woman didn't move at first, didn't even acknowledge my presence as I stood there dripping on the worn linoleum floor. She just stared at me with eyes that looked deeply sunken, almost hollowed out in the dim fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Her skin had the thin, yellowish pallor of old newspaper left too long in the sun, deeply wrinkled and fragile-looking. "Are you open?" I asked, shifting uncomfortably as water continued to drip from my coat onto the stained carpet that might have once been a cheerful blue, but now looked faded to a dull gray. She didn't answer right away, didn't even blink as far as I could tell. Then she nodded once, slow and deliberate, like the simple motion required a tremendous amount of concentration or effort on her part. "How much for a night?" I pressed, glancing around the cramped space filled with dusty brochures for local attractions that probably hadn't existed in years and a corkboard pinned with yellowed notices about checkout times and no-smoking policies. She rose from her chair without a sound, reached under the counter with a hand that trembled slightly, and slid a single key across the scarred wooden desk. A cheap plastic tag dangled from the ring. 66. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet, still damp from the rain. $20? She nodded again, just as slowly, and pointed one gnarled finger at the key as if that settled everything. I glanced back through the grimy window toward the car. Emily was still inside, the interior light on now, fogging up the glass as she watched me with that nervous look she gets when she senses I'm about to make a questionable choice but doesn't want to say it out loud. I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, weighing the creeping unease against the bone-deep exhaustion pulling at me. Then I took the key, feeling the cold metal bite into my palm. When I got back to the car, rain still hammering the roof like impatient fingers, I dangled the key in front of her with forced cheer. "Friendly lady, said it's quiet tonight, but they've got room for us." Emily looked around the desolate courtyard, her eyes lingering on the boarded windows and the shadows pooling in the corners. "It's creepy as hell here. Why don't we just keep going? We could make it farther if we push through." "One night," I said, shifting the car into gear and easing it over to the spot in front of room 66. "We're both wrecked from the drive. One night won't kill us and we'll be laughing about it over breakfast tomorrow." Famous last words that echo in my head now, every single time I close my eyes. Room 66 looked surprisingly better than I had expected from the rundown exterior, almost like someone had made a half-hearted attempt to modernize it at some point without disturbing the bones of the place. White walls that had been painted recently enough not to carry that lingering musty smell of neglect, a decent flat-screen TV mounted on the dresser with a remote that actually had batteries, a small fridge humming quietly in the corner stocked with nothing but still cold enough to chill a couple of sodas if we'd had them. The bathroom had hot water that came out with actual pressure instead of a sad trickle, and the towels folded on the bed were clean, if a bit threadbare at the edges. There was even a little potted plant on the windowsill, some kind of hardy succulent that hadn't wilted yet despite the dim light filtering through the curtains. The only odd thing that caught my eye was the second door at the back of the room, solid wood with no window, a heavy deadbolt locked on our side. I tried the handle out of curiosity, giving it a jiggle. Locked tight. Probably a storage closet for cleaning supplies or some kind of maintenance access to the plumbing between units. We both shrugged it off and forgot about it after we took turns in the shower, steaming away the chill from the rain, then climbed into the surprisingly comfortable bed. Emily was out within minutes, the way she always crashes when she's truly exhausted, her breathing evening out into that soft rhythm that usually lulls me to sleep too. I lay awake longer, listening to the rain continue to hammer against the flat roof and the wind rattle the thin windows like it was trying to find a way inside. Eventually, the fatigue won out, and I drifted off into uneasy sleep. I woke around 2 in the morning, disoriented and thirsty, the kind of abrupt wakefulness that comes from a dream you can't quite remember but leaves you unsettled anyway. It started with footsteps overhead, clear and unmistakable, even over the fading rumble of the storm outside. Not the random, scattered patter of lingering raindrops hitting the flat roof in irregular bursts. Deliberate steps, back and forth across what should have been empty space above us, like someone pacing with purpose, heavy enough to make the ceiling creak faintly with each pass. I told myself it was probably a raccoon that had found its way onto the roof during the downpour, or maybe even a maintenance worker braving the weather to check for leaks in the shingles after all that rain. But the steps kept going, growing heavier and more insistent with each circuit, until they came to a sudden stop directly above our bed, as if whatever was up there had paused to listen right back. Silence fell heavy in the room. Then the bathroom door, which I'd left wide open earlier when I'd gone in to brush my teeth, began to creak closed on its own, slow and steady like an invisible hand was guiding it. I watched it move in the dim glow from the parking lot lights leaking through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the carpet. The floor was level. I'd checked when we first came in, no noticeable tilt that would cause doors to swing on their hinges, no draft stirring the air either, nothing strong enough to push it. The door kept closing anyway, cutting off the faint light spilling from the bathroom until the room plunged closer to black. I had the sudden, irrational certainty that something was standing in the bathtub just out of sight, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I lunged out of bed and jammed my fingers into the narrowing gap just before the door latched shut completely. Flicked on the light switch with my free hand, flooding the small space with harsh fluorescent glare. Empty. No one in the tub. No wet footprints on the white tile floor. Just my own reflection staring back from the mirror over the sink, looking pale and wide-eyed with shadows under the eyes from the long drive. I propped the door open again, wider this time to make sure it stayed put, and waited a full minute, staring at it. It didn't move an inch. I tested different positions, angling it halfway, then almost closed. Nothing. The door stayed exactly where I left it, mocking my growing unease. I went back to bed, heart still hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Emily hadn't stirred at all through any of it. I lay there staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks, the storm making the building settle in weird ways. Then I saw a shadow move past the window, tall, human-shaped, walking slow across the courtyard just outside the curtains. I sat up slowly. The parking lot light flickered once, twice, and went out completely. The room went pitch dark, not even the faint neon from the office sign reaching through anymore. I shook Emily's shoulder. "Wake up. Please wake up." She didn't move, didn't even twitch. I shook harder, leaning close. "Emily, come on." Nothing. Her breathing stayed deep and even, like she was drugged or something worse. Then I heard it. A key sliding into the lock of the second door, the one we thought was just a closet. The deadbolt turned with a slow, deliberate click. A cold draft moved through the room, carrying the smell of wet concrete and something older underneath, like damp earth after a long, forgotten rain, stirring the curtains faintly. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My body felt locked in place, muscles frozen while my mind screamed at me to run, to grab Emily and bolt for the car. The door drifted open on its own, hinges silent. Beyond it was a corridor, not a closet. A long, narrow hallway stretching back into impossible darkness, lit only by a faint red glow pulsing from somewhere far down the line. Doors lined both sides, every single one identical, numbered 666 in faded gold paint that caught the light strangely. I felt myself stand up. Not my choice. My legs moved without any input from me, carrying me toward the opening step by unwilling step. I tried to stop, tried to turn back toward the bed, but my body ignored every command, like strings were pulling me forward. All I could control was my neck, so I twisted to look at Emily one last time. She was sitting up in bed now, eyes wide open, watching me go. Her face was wrong, hollow, lifeless, the same empty expression the old woman at the desk had worn when she handed me the key. She raised one finger to her lips. Shh. Then she smiled wide, and blood ran out of her mouth, thick and dark like oil, spilling over her chin and down her chest onto the sheets. I tried to scream her name. No sound came out, just a dry rasp in my throat. The force pulled me fully into the corridor. The door to our room closed behind me with a soft final click that echoed down the hall. The hallway stretched in both directions, endless as far as I could see in the dim red light, walls closing in tighter the farther my eyes went. The red glow brightened at one end, pulsing like a heartbeat I could feel in my chest, growing warmer with each throb until sweat beaded on my skin. From behind the doors came voices, people I knew, voices I hadn't heard in years. My grandfather, who died when I was 12, calling my name in that gravelly tone he used when he was disappointed, saying it was my fault he'd gone too soon because I hadn't visited enough. A college friend who overdosed years ago after a party I'd dragged him to, pounding on the wood from inside, begging me to let him out, whispering that if I'd just stayed with him that night, he'd still be alive. They weren't angry in the way you'd expect. They were sad, resigned, like they'd been waiting a long time for me to show up and finally take responsibility. They wanted me to join them, to open the doors and step inside. I don't know how long I stood there in that hallway, frozen while the voices overlapped and the red light grew hotter, closer, until it felt like my skin was blistering under invisible flames. Time folded in on itself, stretching minutes into hours or compressing days into seconds. I couldn't tell anymore. The air thickened with the smell of smoke and blood, and the pulsing heartbeat echoed louder in my ears until it drowned out everything else. Then I was back in the car. I was driving down the road, hands shaking uncontrollably on the wheel. Rain still falling, but lighter now, more mist than storm. Emily was slumped in the passenger seat, head lolled against the window, eyes closed and face pale. She wasn't moving, her chest rising and falling so shallowly I had to watch for a full minute to convince myself she was breathing at all. I pulled off at the next turn, found the nearest town with lights still on in the windows, drove straight to the first house that looked occupied, and collapsed on the front porch, pounding on the door while babbling incoherently about motels and hidden corridors and blood pouring from smiles. Someone inside called an ambulance, wrapped me in a blanket while we waited, asked questions I couldn't answer coherently. Emily was airlifted to the nearest hospital that same night. They said coma. No visible trauma, no drugs in her system, no medical explanation they could find after every test. Just deep, unresponsive sleep, like something had switched her off and taken the key. I told the police everything the next day, sitting in a sterile interview room with bad coffee and a recorder running. They listened politely, took detailed notes, asked follow-up questions that sounded skeptical even when they tried to hide it, then told me the lodge had closed down for good in the late 60s after a man snapped and killed his entire family in room 66 one stormy night. The building had been abandoned ever since, condemned and left to rot, no utilities hooked up, no record of it ever reopening or anyone squatting there long-term. No old woman working a front desk, no neon sign that still worked after decades of neglect. They think I did something to her, even if they haven't said it outright yet. Emily's family won't speak to me at all, won't even look at me when we pass in the hospital hallways. They're there every day, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, waiting for her to wake up and tell them what really happened. My parents flew out last week as soon as I called them, pale and worried, trying to hold everything together. My dad's already talking to lawyers because there's quiet talk floating around about possible charges if she doesn't come out of it soon. If the doctors start throwing around words like permanent or irreversible. I keep going over that night in my head, replaying every moment like a bad movie on loop, trying to find the exact point where I could have turned around and changed everything. The moment I should have listened to Emily when she said the place was creepy and just kept driving through the rain. The moment I took that damn key from the old woman instead of dropping it on the counter and getting back in the car to push on until dawn broke and we found somewhere safe. The moment I didn't scream louder or fight harder against whatever pulled me into that corridor. I don't know what happened in that hallway, what those voices really were, or why they knew things only I could have told them. I don't know how I got us both out, or why Emily is still trapped in that endless sleep while I'm left here wide awake and haunted. I don't know why every time I close my eyes now I hear those same voices behind the doors, still calling my name, still waiting for me to answer. I didn't believe in ghosts. I don't anymore. But I'm not sure what else to call whatever opened that second door and let something in that won't let go. It's been 2 weeks now, and the doctors say there's no change in Emily's condition, no sign she's getting better or worse, just stuck in that limbo where her body keeps going, but her mind stays somewhere else I can't reach. I visit every day, sit by her bed holding her hand, talking to her about nothing and everything, hoping my voice will pull her back like it did when she had nightmares as a kid. Her family glares from the doorway, but they let me stay. Maybe because deep down they know I love her, maybe because they're waiting for me to slip up and say something that proves their suspicions. The police came by again yesterday, asking the same questions with new angles, like they're building a case one careful word at a time. Last night I dreamed about the corridor again, but this time the doors were open and the voices weren't calling. They were whispering promises, saying Emily would wake if I just walked a little farther down the hall. I woke up sweating, the smell of damp earth in the room, and for a second I swear I saw the number 666 etched faintly on the hotel door where I'm staying now. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up before I break, before I drive back to that motel and see if it's really abandoned or if the old woman is still waiting with another key, ready to hand it over without a word. I run a small paranormal website that's been my main source of income for the past 7 years. I write about everything in the Fortean realm, ghost sightings, Dybbuk boxes that supposedly curse anyone who opens them, shadow people caught on doorbell cameras, poltergeist activity in quiet suburbs, really anything strange enough to draw clicks from people who want to believe. I keep my tone neutral in the articles, never outright skeptical, never dismissive. The community hates skeptics. They see us as joyless gatekeepers who ruin the fun, people who demand proof before they'll even entertain the possibility that something extraordinary might be real. I get it. I've been on the receiving end of the backlash more than once when I've asked basic questions about evidence or methodology. But the truth is, I'm not trying to debunk anything. I lost both my parents in a car accident when I was 10. The grief never really left. It just changed shape over the years. If there's even a chance the dead can come back, even a sliver of proof that an afterlife exists, I want it more than anything. I'd give almost anything to talk to them again, to ask if they're okay, where they are, whether death hurts, or if it's just quiet. That's why I keep the site running. That's why I answer every message, read every tip, chase every lead. I'm not looking to disprove the paranormal. I'm looking for something that will finally convince me it's real. When the first text came in from someone who called himself Clay, I didn't think much of it. I get dozens of messages like that every week, usually through the contact form on the site or my public email, rarely to my personal number. I have no idea how he got it. Maybe I gave it out once on a podcast. Maybe it leaked somewhere. The message was simple. I can prove to you the paranormal exists. I ignored it. I've heard that line before. Usually it leads to blurry photos, EVPs that sound like radio static, or someone trying to sell me a cursed object for $300 plus shipping. My phone buzzed again 10 minutes later. I know you've received this. My phone's told me. That made me pause. Delivery receipts don't usually show up that fast, and I hadn't even opened the thread. I stared at the screen for a long minute, thumb hovering over the block button, then set the phone face down on the nightstand and went to bed. I figured if he was determined enough, he'd email instead. They always do. The next message came at 3:17 a.m., just as I was finally drifting off. I'll give you a taster, nothing big, but promise you will take me up on my offer if you do experience something tonight. I was half asleep, irritated, not thinking clearly. Against every instinct, I typed back one word. Fine. Then I turned the phone off completely and tried to forget about it. Sleep didn't come easy. I woke up around 4:30 in a full panic, heart slamming against my ribs, sheets soaked through with sweat even though the room was freezing. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the glass of water on the nightstand. I hadn't had a panic attack like that since I was a teenager, not since the months right after the accident when every loud noise or sudden silence sent me spiraling. I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing into my cupped hands until the room stopped spinning, then stumbled into the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists the way my uncle taught me when I was 10. He'd never had kids of his own, never really known what to do with a grieving boy, but he'd figured out the wrist trick by trial and error during those long nights when I was convinced I was dying. The cold helped. It always had. I stood there until my fingers went numb and my pulse slowed to something manageable, then dried off and slipped back into bed. The sheets were clammy now, chilled from the sweat. I pulled the blanket up anyway. My phone screen lit up on the nightstand. One new message. Did you wake up? It was from Clay, timestamped 4:28, minutes after I'd sat up gasping. I stared at the words until the screen timed out and went dark again. My stomach turned over. I told myself it was coincidence. People wake up at night all the time, he was guessing. Or he'd messaged at random and I just happened to be awake, but the timing felt too perfect, too deliberate. I didn't reply. I turned the phone completely off, pulled the charger out of the wall, and lay there listening to my own heartbeat until morning came. He didn't message again the next day, or the day after. I started to relax, started to convince myself it had been nothing, a lucky guess from someone who'd probably sent the same text to a dozen other people and gotten lucky with one of them. By Friday, my skepticism was back in full force. I'd even drafted a short post about it for the site, framing it as a classic cold reading trick: plant the idea of a supernatural event right before sleep, then claim credit when the subconscious does what it always does and produces a nightmare. Textbook suggestion. Textbook manipulation. Then the message came. Did I convince you? I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I should have blocked him. I should have deleted the thread. Instead, I typed back. Hardly. A reply popped up almost instantly. Come on, I was right, wasn't I? You woke in a sweat. You dreamt of a hanged man. My mouth went dry. I hadn't remembered the dream clearly when I woke up. Just the panic, the cold, the pounding heart. But now fragments came back. A man hanging from a beam in an old room, face purple, eyes bulging, laughing as the rope tightened. I dismissed it as stress, as leftover grief, as my mind replaying the worst night of my childhood. But Clay had named it exactly. And he'd sent the message after I woke, not before. Hadn't he? I scrolled up. The "I'm the hanged man" text had come at 4:32, 4 minutes after I'd sat up in bed. If he'd sent it before I woke, I would have seen it first thing. But I hadn't. I'd been too shaken to check my phone until after the wrist trick. So either he was guessing again, or he knew the moment I woke up. Either way, the hair on my arms stood up. Curious now, I replied. Say I play along. What are you going to show me next? The response was immediate. I need some promises from you. I'm not agreeing to anything without knowing what they are. That's fine. But you will need to agree before the next stage. It's important. Tell me what they are. You need to bring a good camera, no phone pics, something with manual settings, high resolution. I don't want anyone saying the photos are too blurry. Bring someone impartial, someone who doesn't believe in the paranormal at all, someone who can be a witness and won't be accused of wanting to see something. Promise you'll write this up for your site, honestly. No hedging, no, maybe it was this disclaimers, just what happens. And one last thing, you take a photo of me to put in the article. I want everyone to know it was me who convinced you, a photo of my choosing. I read it twice. It was a lot, more than I usually agree to. But if he really had proof, If he could show me something undeniable, I couldn't walk away from it. Not when I'd spent my whole adult life looking. I typed back, "You have a deal." He sent the address immediately. A stately home in the countryside, 2 hours north of Stockton. He'd rented the entire place for the weekend. The cost must have been staggering. I wondered if he'd booked it on spec, so certain I'd say yes, or if he'd been waiting for the right mark to come along. I almost backed out right then, just to spite him. But I didn't. I called my friend Steve the next day. He's a sound engineer, practical to a fault, openly dismissive of anything paranormal, perfect witness. When I told him the story, he laughed for a full minute. "You're getting catfished by a ghost hunter with too much money," he said. "But sure, I'll come. If nothing else, it'll be hilarious." We drove up as the sun was setting. The house looked exactly like the photos online. Grand, old, isolated, surrounded by acres of dark trees and rolling fields. Clay was waiting in the lobby, a large, open space with twin staircases curving up to the second floor. He was older than I'd pictured, late 60s maybe, short white hair, lean build that suggested he still worked out regularly. He shook my hand firmly, shook Steve's, thanked us for coming. "Things are going to happen quickly," he said. "I need you set up now." "What exactly are we going to see?" I asked. "There's a little girl who haunts the house. She runs around upstairs. If you chase her, she comes downstairs and crosses the lobby here." He pointed to the open space between the staircases. "Set your camera there, interval timer, 1 photo every second." I unfolded my tripod, mounted the DSLR, checked the settings. Manual focus, high ISO, wide aperture. Clay watched closely but didn't touch anything. I took a test shot. He inspected the preview on the screen, nodded approval. "Start it up." I set the interval timer. The shutter began its steady click, click, click. "I need to get her to come down," he said, and before I could respond, he was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, disappearing from view. "This is stupid," I muttered to Steve. "What do you mean, aren't you excited?" "There's no ghost. He set this up. He even told me exactly where to put the camera." "Is that her?" Steve asked, turning toward the stairs. I heard footsteps then. Heavy, deliberate, an older man's shoes on hardwood. Clay, obviously, moving around upstairs. "It's him," I said. "I can tell the difference between a man running and a child skipping." Silence followed. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. I was starting to get impatient. Then Clay appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard, face flushed. "Did you see her?" I shook my head. He came down slowly, looking defeated. "There's your photo for the article," he said, stepping in front of the camera and letting it snap him once, twice, 3 times. I almost laughed. All that buildup, all that money, and he couldn't even pull off his own trick. I wondered how many times he'd tried this with other people. "Can you bring the camera upstairs?" he asked. "She might be in one of the rooms." I sighed, picked up the tripod, followed him. Steve trailed behind, still amused. I checked ceilings for projectors, looked for mirrors or glass setups that could create illusions. Nothing obvious. "I saw her in here earlier," Clay said, pointing to a closed door at the end of the upstairs hall. "Set it here." I positioned the camera in the hallway facing the door, left the timer running. Clay pushed the door open. The shutter kept clicking. The room was empty at first glance, old furniture under dust sheets, heavy curtains drawn. Then I saw it. A small body hung from the rafters. "What the fuck?" I whispered. Steve was already running, feet pounding down the stairs. I heard the front door slam. I stepped closer, shaking. Another body hung beside the first, adult-sized, face bloated and red, eyes bulging. The hands still twitched faintly. I recognized the clothes, the build. It was Clay. I backed out of the room. My legs felt like water. I made it downstairs, out the front door, into the night air. Steve was in the car, engine running, pale as death. We drove straight to the nearest police station. I don't remember most of the conversation. I just kept seeing those bodies, the slow sway, the twitching fingers. The police took our statements. They said Clay had rented the house for the weekend, No record of any little girl. No reports of hauntings. They took my camera as evidence. I didn't argue. A week later, they ruled it murder-suicide. Clay had killed a child. His granddaughter, they later confirmed, then himself. No sign of anyone else in the house. No evidence of staging. They returned my camera eventually. The memory card was blank. They said it must have been wiped during processing. I didn't believe them. I still don't. I know what I saw. I know the camera was running. I know Clay stepped in front of it downstairs minutes before I found him upstairs. I haven't posted anything about it on the site. I can't. Not yet. Because if I do, I have to keep my promise. I have to write it honestly. I have to publish the photo he wanted. And I don't know what happens if I break that promise. I don't know what happens if I don't. I've been able to see them when I drink for about 15 years now, and I still don't know exactly why it works that way or what twist of fate or biology made me this way in the first place. But I've come to accept it as a strange gift that comes with its own set of heavy burdens. It started on prom night when I was 17, the first time I ever got properly drunk on cheap vodka smuggled in a water bottle and passed around behind the gym until the world around me tilted on its axis and everything felt simultaneously too bright, too loud, and too distant all at once. I ended up stumbling into the girls' restroom to throw up in one of the stalls, my head spinning wildly, my stomach heaving uncontrollably, when I heard someone crying in the stall directly across from me, soft and broken sobs that somehow cut through the thick fog in my brain and made me pause mid-retch. I wiped my mouth on the sleeve of my rented dress, steadied myself against the cold metal partition that separated the stalls, and looked over with bleary eyes to see what was going on. I almost jumped back in surprise when I saw her sitting there, but I quickly caught myself, only letting a small gasp escape from my lips as the shock registered through the alcohol haze. If I hadn't already puked everything out by that point, the sudden fright would have sobered me up instantly and left me reeling even more. There, in the stall right across from me, was a girl perched on the closed toilet lid, her head hanging low with long dark hair obscuring her face completely, her shoulders shaking with each quiet sob that escaped her. Her clothes were simple and kind of old-fashioned, something out of the 80s with a plain sweater and jeans that didn't match the glittery dresses and formal wear everyone else was sporting that night, and I was pretty sure I hadn't seen her around school before or heard anyone come into the bathroom while I was busy being sick. I cleared my throat audibly, trying to get her attention without startling her further. "Hi there," I stammered, not quite sure what to say to a crying stranger in a high school bathroom during what was supposed to be one of the best nights of our teenage lives. "I didn't hear you come in. You startled me a little." I let out a nervous chuckle that sounded forced even to my own ears. No reply came from her at all. I took a few hesitant steps toward her, looking her up and down as best I could in the partial darkness of the room where the fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead. It was hard to see clearly with the shadows playing tricks, but she definitely wasn't dressed up for prom like the rest of us. Her outfit too casual and dated, and I couldn't place her face among any of the students I knew from classes or hallways. I was pretty sure I hadn't seen her around before that moment. Are you all right?" I asked gently, trying to sound comforting despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Is there anything I can help you with? Anything I could do to make it better?" Again, no response came, just the continued soft sobs that echoed slightly off the tiled walls. "Would you like to talk about it?" I offered, taking another small step closer, hoping she'd look up or say something. It was then that I noticed something was terribly wrong with the way she was holding her arms. Her palms turned upward, and her hands kept deliberately away from her shirt, as if she didn't want to stain it with something. The blood was slowly dripping from her hands, thin red lines trailing down her forearms and pooling on the floor between her feet. I was pretty sure I hadn't seen her around before. "Oh my God, what have you done?" I gasped, my voice rising in panic as the reality hit me. We need to get you to a hospital right now. Come on, get up, let me help you." I bent down and reached out to grab her shoulder to help pull her to her feet, but my hand went straight through her like she was made of mist or smoke. My eyes widened in terror as the impossibility sank in. It couldn't be happening. I slowly reached out once again to touch her, my fingers trembling now. But again, there was nothing there. Just empty air where her body should have been solid. It was then that I realized it, the truth crashing over me like a cold wave. The girl slowly lifted her head, but before I could see her face clearly or make out any details, she vanished completely, disappearing into thin air as if she had never been there at all. I stumbled backward and landed hard on the cold bathroom floor, my heart pounding wildly. It took me a long while to completely comprehend the whole situation and process what I had just witnessed, my mind racing to catch up with the impossible. The first thing I did once I gathered myself was look her up online and in old school records. And indeed, there had been a student at my high school who had committed suicide in one of the restrooms back in 1986. Her name was Pamela, and the details matched perfectly. I even found a picture of her in an archived yearbook, and I immediately recognized her. The hair, the sweater, the sad expression in her eyes that I'd glimpsed for just a fraction of a second. I had seen a ghost. There was no other explanation that fit. I couldn't believe it at first, but when it all began to sink in and I couldn't deny it anymore, I started conducting some careful experiments to see if it was a one-time fluke or something more. I visited tons of allegedly haunted locations all over the area just to find out if I could see other dead people or spirits lingering around. But nothing ever happened, no matter how long I waited or how hard I concentrated. Then I tried recreating certain elements of that evening to trigger it again, like going back to the school's restroom during off hours, but they threw me out and threatened to call security, saying former students aren't allowed to come by unannounced without permission. Sometime later, I finally had the idea to try out drinking like I had that night, replicating the exact state I was in, and what can I say? It worked every time, the veil lifting as the alcohol hit my system. I started reorienting my career around it, shifting from odd jobs to something that let me explore this ability without drawing too much unwanted attention. If I learned one thing during the time I've been doing this job, it's that most people in this business are fake. Charlatans who prey on the vulnerable with cold readings and staged effects. A lot of them don't even believe in ghosts themselves. They just use some cheap tricks and make up semi-heartwarming stories to make profit from the mourning loved ones of the recent deceased, stringing them along with false hope. I've met a few really nice people though too, genuine seekers who actually want to help others find peace or closure. But that's not what this is about. This is about the most horrifying experience I ever had, the one that still wakes me up some nights. It was 3 years ago and I was still pretty new to the job, still figuring out my limits and how to handle the emotional weight of what I saw. I had gotten a call by a middle-aged couple who wanted me to contact their twin daughters who had disappeared 2 months prior without a trace. The disappearance had been ruled as a kidnapping case by the authorities and investigations were still ongoing, but leads had dried up fast. The parents were distraught, broken in ways I could see before they even spoke. They had told me over the phone that they had never really believed in the paranormal, psychics, or any of that stuff, but that they were desperate to find their children and would try anything at this point. I felt terribly sorry for them and immediately got on my way, knowing the pain of loss too well from my own past. It took me about 3 hours to get to their place, including the small detour to get booze from a corner store along the route. I arrived to find a beautiful large house that might have looked like a warm family home under different circumstances if it weren't for the strange, dark atmosphere surrounding the place that made my skin prickle. The closer I got to the building, the worse it became, the air turning cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. It all felt so distant and unfamiliar, like the house itself was rejecting visitors. I remember thinking it was weird even before I knocked. I wasn't even drunk yet, so it wasn't the ability kicking in early. The lady who welcomed me in looked pretty normal at first glance, except for the large bags under her eyes and her tear-swollen face that spoke of endless nights without sleep. She frowned in confusion as she glanced down at the bottle in my hand, clearly unsure what to make of it. "Good evening. Are you the—" "Yes, that's me," I quickly replied, trying to sound professional despite the awkwardness. "Oh, come in then," she said in a brittle voice that cracked slightly at the edges. She led me over into the living room where her husband sat at the large table reading a newspaper he clearly wasn't absorbing. He looked just as beaten as his wife, his eyes distant and hollow. As he stood up to greet me and shook my hand, I could clearly see that he harbored some doubts about my work and what I claimed to do. I didn't blame him, though. I guess the bottle of vodka in my hand didn't help me seem very convincing or legitimate. Mr. and Mrs. Davis, I am very sorry about what happened to your daughters, I said gently. I am not one to make false promises, but I will try my best to help in any way I can. Could you tell me a little more about them to start? Mr. Davis cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse or emotion. Missy and Lucy. We named them Missy and Lucy. We wanted them to have similar sounding names because… His voice broke off, trailing into silence. They are identical twins, Mrs. Davis chimed in, her words steady, but her hands twisting a tissue in her lap. They're really clever, good at school, and always eager to learn new things. Missy's favorite color is green and Lucy's is blue. They turned 11 not too long ago. I don't know what to do anymore. Tears began welling up in her eyes again. I just want them back so badly. Her husband leaned over to hug her tightly, holding her as she shook. Turning back to me, he added, We don't know if they're still alive. So maybe calling you here is just a waste of time too. The police seemed to think so as well when we mentioned it. But at this point we're just desperate for answers, no matter the way we get them. We're open to try anything, so just tell us what we need to do to make this work. I remember frowning slightly at his statement, wondering why they would have told the police about contacting someone like me in the first place. I figured I was overthinking it and shrugged it off as them being thorough or hoping for any lead. So, this might seem kind of weird to you, but I have a bit of a unique method of working that's a little unconventional, I explained. I already asked you to find a different place to stay for a few hours over the phone, just for the time that I'm here doing what I do. Are you ready to leave then so I can get started? Yes, Mr. Davis replied. He looked like he wanted to add something, but I interrupted him to address the obvious concern. I already know you locked away your valuables, I said. I wasn't planning on stealing anything, it's just a precaution I recommend. The couple exchanged awkward glances, and Mrs. Davis quickly said, Also, the upstairs bathroom is under renovation right now. If you need to use the bathroom, please use the one on this floor downstairs. Got it, I replied, placing my bottle on the table. Oh, and I'm gonna need a glass and some orange juice if you've got some to mix with this. It didn't take a lot of time for the vodka's effect to set in and start working its way through my system. I don't hold the strong stuff very well, so it was just a matter of, half an hour or so before the warmth began to spread. Mr. and Mrs. Davis had gone off to see a movie at the local theater, another thing that struck me as sort of odd given the circumstances. Lord knows that if my kids were missing, I wouldn't be able to focus on anything, let alone a 2-hour film with popcorn and previews. I figured they probably needed some kind of distraction, though, to keep from completely falling apart. The last 2 months had probably been absolute hell for them. Every day, a new kind of torture. As the warm feeling began to spread in my stomach and loosen my muscles, the air around me seemed to grow even heavier than it had been when I first arrived. I felt myself becoming susceptible, the veil between the ordinary and the other side thinning as it always did. I leaned back in my chair and waited, letting the alcohol do its job. There was an air of sorrow, of deep pain in this room. It was so strong that it felt legitimately oppressive and hard to breathe through. But there was something else underneath it all. Rage, an underlying touch of cruelty that lingered like a bad aftertaste. I could feel it building. I slowly got up from my chair and placed my empty glass on the floor. I hadn't drunken enough for any of my motor skills to be impaired yet, just enough to open the door. I walked around the living room, trying to determine the center of the strange energy that pulsed through the house. Suddenly I heard a voice, high-pitched and soft like a child's whisper. It was little more than a faint murmur, but quite clearly the voice of a child speaking directly to me. Upstairs. I spun around to see the wavering, unclear outline of 2 girls standing behind me, right next to the living room door that led to the hallway. I swallowed down my surprise. So they were dead indeed. That much was clear now. But why were they here in their own home? Did it mean that the kidnapper had killed them inside the house and then taken away their bodies to hide the evidence? Missy? Lucy? I asked, trying to suppress the quivering of my own voice as I addressed them. Needle and thread, they spoke in unison this time, their voices just as fragile as their flickering silhouette that wavered like heat off pavement. I squinted my eyes to see them better. Something about the way they were standing was off, so close, right next to one another as if they couldn't separate. But I just couldn't put my finger on it exactly. Their image was just too faint, like a faded drawing on old paper. And suddenly, they were gone, vanished as quickly as they had appeared. "Wait!" I shouted. Then I remembered what they had said. Upstairs, up the stairs, up the stairs, up the stairs. My mind seemed to scream at me as I rushed to climb the steps to the second floor, taking them two at a time. I looked up just in time to catch another glimpse of the twins standing atop the staircase, staring down at me with wide eyes, before they vanished out of sight once again like smoke in the wind. "Lucy? Where are you? Missy?" I yelled out, looking around frantically as I came to a halt in the second floor's hallway, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Then I felt it. For just a split second, I could feel the cold lips of one of the dead children right next to my ear, brushing against the skin. I didn't dare to turn my head in fear of scaring her away. I stood as still as a statue as she whispered two words. "The bathroom. The bathroom." A terrible suspicion began to grow within me, twisting in my gut. Renovations. Renovations, my ass, I thought. I rushed along the hallway hurriedly, checking each room to make sure. I passed the parents' bedroom with its neatly made bed, a room filled with toys and games which I assumed had belonged to the twins, and another staircase leading up to what was probably an attic or additional rooms. There was an additional floor above this one, which was probably where the twins' actual bedrooms were located. But my destination lay at the far end of the hallway, the door closed tight. As I ran towards the door, the hallway seemed to stretch itself to a surreal length, like something out of a nightmare. The door was locked. Of course it was. The room was under renovations after all, they had said. I kicked, I banged and threw myself against it until the weak, aged doorframe finally gave in with a splintering crack. To my surprise, the bathroom looked relatively normal inside. There was nothing off about it at first glance, just clean tiles and fixtures. I looked around, searched every corner for any sign. Nothing. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary that would explain the pull. "Oh, damn," I muttered under my breath. I would have a hard time explaining this to Mr. and Mrs. Davis when they got back, the broken door and my intrusion. But then, there they were again. They were standing in the middle of the room, staring at me with large, pleading eyes that seemed too old for their faces. This time I could clearly see what was wrong with them. Their bodies. They were attached at the sides, sewn together with crude stitches. The rags they were wearing were blood-stained and dirty, crusted with old grime. It took a few seconds for the realization to set in, and when it did, my blood ran cold. Needle and thread. "No, no, no, no. Please don't tell me that's how you died," I whispered, my voice barely audible. One of the girls gently tapped the bathroom tile she was standing on with her bare foot. I looked down and my eyes widened. There was a set of tiles in the floor that looked much newer than the other ones surrounding them. They were cleaner and didn't have any scratches yet, standing out like a patch. The grout holding them together was fresher too, not discolored with age. I took out my pocket knife and hastily began scraping away at it, the twins still standing over me, watching silently. I don't know how long it took me to dig through. My knife went dull pretty soon from the effort. I found a screwdriver in one of the cabinets under the sink and kept at it until finally I had scratched off enough for the tile to be loose enough to lift. Using the blade of my knife as a lever, I pried the tile up. I gagged as I stared into the empty eye sockets of the decomposing head underneath it. The stench that wafted out of the hole was almost worse than the sight itself, thick and rotten. I looked up at the sad, watery eyes of the twins. They had sat down in front of me now. The girl on the left reached out to touch the remains of the face I had uncovered, her hand passing through without disturbing anything. "That's me," she breathed softly. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, hot and unbidden. Who did this to you?" I already knew the answer deep down, but I had to hear it from them to confirm. "Daddy does bad things," the girl on the right said softly. "But Mommy's worse. the girl on the left added. I nodded, swallowing hard. I pulled out my cell phone, dialed 911, and upon being asked what my emergency was, I simply said, I found the two missing girls. After hanging up, I looked back at the girls. They said they're going to be here in 10 minutes. Would you like to tell me what exactly happened while we wait? The twins exchanged pensive glances before the one on the right spoke up. Mommy didn't give us anything to eat. We were hungry for days. We wanted out. We tried to flee, but they caught us before we could get far. Mommy was really mad at us. She said we wouldn't go anywhere again. Ever. Needle and thread. Needle and thread. We sat in silence for another 8 minutes or something like that. I looked at them, and they looked back at me. They didn't look all that sad anymore, more resigned. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud knocking at the front door downstairs. I got up. That must be them. Are you girls going to be fine? I asked as their features began flickering and slowly dissolving in front of my eyes. They didn't respond, and before I knew it, they were gone. I quickly wiped away my tears and rushed downstairs to open the door. It took quite some time to explain everything to the police who arrived with lights flashing and sirens cutting through the night. I think the official statement says something along the lines of, the investigator found the corpses by accident, or some vague wording to cover how it really happened. Nonsense. I don't really care though. They can believe whatever they want or write whatever makes sense on paper. The Davises were arrested pretty much on the spot when they returned home, and their confession was just as harrowing as expected from what I overheard. Apparently, Mrs. Davis had some sort of mental illness that caused her to have sudden anger outbursts, and Mr. Davis would gladly let his frustration out on his daughters during those times. When they had given their children nothing to eat for 2 entire days as punishment, the girls attempted to run away in desperation. They didn't get very far, though. Needle and thread. It's these 3 words that have never left my mind since, echoing like a curse. This was their cause of death, the cruel method chosen. I don't know how long they survived sewn together like that, but it couldn't have been long, the pain and infection too much for small bodies. When they died, their parents hid their corpses under the bathroom tiles and renewed them to cover the evidence. The cops hadn't paid attention to them when they had searched the house earlier, missing the fresh grout. Apparently, the Davis wanted to play the role of the grieving parents perfectly, which is why they told everyone that they would be calling a paranormal investigator to try everything possible. They hadn't expected me to find anything. Of course they hadn't. They had looked up the one who, out of everyone in this business, seemed least legitimate and most like a fraud. Seeing as I explain my methods on my website, I'm really not surprised they'd think I was just some crazy weirdo who drank on the job. Well, not everyone believes in ghosts, and they counted on that. I don't know what you were expecting when I said I'd tell you about the creepiest thing I ever saw. Probably a demon or something monstrous from old folklore. If so, sorry to disappoint. It's kind of funny though, isn't it? In the end, the worst thing I ever encountered when communicating with the souls of the deceased were 2 very alive humans, flesh and blood monsters hiding behind normal faces. As for the twins, I really hope they're doing all right now, wherever they ended up. I have a feeling they're fine, finally at peace after what they endured. I've spent most of my adult life chasing things that most people would call impossible, and for a long time I thought I was good at it. Good enough to carve out a modest living writing about the strange, the unexplained, the things that slip through the cracks when the rest of the world isn't paying attention or refuses to look too closely. I run a small paranormal website that's been my primary source of income since I was 25, back when I realized I could turn my lifelong obsession into something that paid rent and kept the lights on. I write about everything in the Fortean realm. Ghost sightings reported in quiet suburbs where nothing ever happens, Dybbuk boxes that supposedly curse anyone who opens them or even owns them for too long, shadow people caught on doorbell cameras at 3 in the morning when the house should be empty, poltergeist activity in otherwise normal houses where the furniture moves on its own and doors slam without wind. Really anything strange enough to draw clicks from people who want to believe there's more to reality than what we can measure with instruments or see with our own eyes. I keep my tone neutral in the articles, never outright skeptical, never dismissive or mocking of the people who submit their stories. The community hates skeptics. They see us as joyless gatekeepers who ruin the fun, people who demand impossible levels of proof before they'll even entertain the possibility that something extraordinary might be real and waiting just beyond the edges of everyday life. I get it completely. I've been on the receiving end of the backlash more than once when I've asked basic questions about evidence or methodology in the comment sections under my own posts. But the truth is, I'm not trying to debunk anything or tear down anyone's experiences. I lost both my parents in a car accident when I was 10. The grief never really left. It just changed shape over the years, grew quieter, but never went away completely, always there like a low hum in the background of every day. If there's even a chance the dead can come back, even a sliver of proof that an afterlife exists and there's still somewhere reachable, I want it more than anything in the world. I'd give almost anything to talk to them again, to ask if they're okay, where they are now, whether death hurts or if it's just quiet and peaceful the way some people say it is. That's why I keep the site running year after year. That's why I answer every message that comes in, read every tip no matter how thin or far-fetched it seems, chase every lead even when my better judgment tells me it's probably nothing. I'm not looking to disprove the paranormal or prove it's all imagination. I'm looking for something that will finally convince me it's real, something solid enough to quiet the part of me that still wakes up some nights convinced they're just gone forever. When the first text came in from someone who called himself Clay, I didn't think much of it at first because messages like that arrive constantly. I get dozens every week, usually through the contact form on the site or my public email address listed at the bottom of every article, rarely ever to my personal number. I have no idea how he got it. Maybe I gave it out once during a podcast interview years ago when I was feeling open and trusting. Maybe it leaked somewhere online and never got scrubbed from whatever database it ended up in. The message was short and direct, the way most of them are when people think they've got something groundbreaking. I can prove to you the paranormal exists. I ignored it. I've heard that exact line before too many times to count over the years. Usually it leads to blurry photos taken on cheap phones in bad lighting, EVPs that sound like radio static or distant traffic filtered through white noise, or someone trying to sell me a cursed object for $300 plus shipping and handling with a money-back guarantee that never quite holds up. I get them all. I've learned to filter most of them out without a second thought. My phone buzzed again 10 minutes later while I was still scrolling through emails. I know you've received this. My phone's told me. That made me pause longer than the first one had. Delivery receipts don't usually show up that fast on my end, and I hadn't even opened the thread or marked it read yet. I stared at the words until the screen timed out and went dark again, leaving me looking at my own reflection in the glass. My stomach turned over slowly, a quiet unease settling in. I told myself it was coincidence. People wake up at night all the time for no reason. He was guessing. Or he'd messaged at random and I just happened to be awake and looking at my phone. But the timing felt too perfect, too deliberate, like he knew exactly when I'd pick it up or when my attention would drift back to it. I didn't reply. I turned the phone completely off, pulled the charger out of the wall for good measure, and lay there listening to my own heartbeat until morning came gray and ordinary through the blinds, the way it always does. He didn't message again the next day, or the day after that. I started to relax, started to convince myself it had been nothing more than a lucky guess from someone who'd probably sent the same text to a dozen other people and gotten lucky with one of them responding. By Friday, my skepticism was back in full force, the kind that settles in comfortably after a few days of nothing happening and no further contact. I'd even drafted a short post for the site about it, framing the whole thing as a classic cold-reading trick. Plant the idea of a supernatural event right before sleep, then claim credit when the subconscious does what it always does and produces a nightmare or a panic attack. Textbook suggestion, textbook manipulation. I almost hit publish that afternoon while drinking coffee at my desk. Then the message came through. Did I convince you? I stared at it for a long time, longer than I wanted to admit. My thumb hovered over the keyboard while I tried to decide whether to block him or keep going. I should have blocked him right then and deleted the thread and changed my number to be safe. Instead, I typed back, "Hardly." A reply popped up almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting with his phone in hand. Come on, I was right, wasn't I? You woke in a sweat. You dreamt of a hanged man. My mouth went dry instantly. I hadn't remembered the dream clearly when I woke up. Just the panic, the cold room, the pounding heart that wouldn't slow down. But now fragments came rushing back in sharp detail. A man hanging from a beam in an old room with peeling wallpaper, face purple and swollen, eyes bulging, laughing as the rope tightened around his neck and cut off his air. I'd dismissed it as stress, as leftover grief from too many late nights thinking about my parents, as my mind replaying the worst night of my childhood when everything changed. But Clay had named it exactly, and he'd sent the message after I woke, not before. Hadn't he? I scrolled up through the thread again, checking timestamps. The "I'm the hanged man" text had come at 4:32, 4 minutes after I'd sat up gasping in bed and stumbled to the bathroom. If he'd sent it before I woke, I would have seen it first thing when I finally checked my phone. But I hadn't. I'd been too shaken, too focused on slowing my breathing and getting my pulse under control to look at notifications until after the wrist trick. So either he was guessing again, impossibly lucky, or he knew the moment I woke up. Either way, the hair on my arm stood up and stayed there for the rest of the morning. Curious now, despite every instinct telling me to walk away and never look back, I replied, "Say I play along. What are you going to show me next?" The response was immediate, almost eager. "I need some promises from you. I'm not agreeing to anything without knowing what they are. That's fine. But you will need to agree before the next stage. It's important. Tell me what they are. You need to bring a good camera. No phone pics. Something with manual settings, high resolution. I don't want anyone saying the photos are too blurry or staged or manipulated. Bring someone impartial. Someone who doesn't believe in the paranormal at all. Someone who can be a witness and won't be accused of wanting to see something supernatural. Promise you'll write this up for your site, honestly. No hedging. No, maybe it was this disclaimers. No skeptical footnotes. Just what happens, plain and straightforward. And one last thing. You take a photo of me to put in the article. I want everyone to know it was me who convinced you. A photo of my choosing, no edits. I read it twice, then a third time. It was a lot. More than I usually agree to for any investigation, more conditions than most people ever ask for. But if he really had proof, if he could show me something undeniable, something I couldn't explain away no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't walk away from it. Not when I'd spent my whole adult life looking for exactly that kind of proof. Something that would finally quiet the part of me that still wakes up some nights convinced my parents are just gone forever and nothing comes after. I typed back, "You have a deal." He sent the address immediately. A stately home in the countryside, 2 hours north of Stockton. He'd rented the entire place for the weekend. The cost must have been staggering, more than I make in a month from ad revenue and Patreon. I wondered if he'd booked it on spec, so certain I'd say yes, or if he'd been waiting for the right mark to come along. I almost backed out right then, just to spite him and prove I wasn't that easy to hook. But I didn't. I called my friend Steve the next day. He's a sound engineer, practical to a fault, openly dismissive of anything paranormal or supernatural. Perfect witness. When I told him the story, he laughed for a full minute straight. "You're getting catfished by a ghost hunter with too much money," he said when he could breathe again. "But sure, I'll come. If nothing else, it'll be hilarious to watch you try to stay skeptical while some guy in a cape tries to summon a demon." We drove up as the sun was setting, the sky turning that bruised purple that makes everything look flatter and more ominous. The house looked exactly like the photos online. Grand, old, isolated, surrounded by acres of dark trees and rolling fields that stretched into shadow as far as the eye could see. Clay was waiting in the lobby, a large open space with twin staircases curving up to the second floor like something out of a period drama. He was older than I'd pictured, late 60s maybe, short white hair, lean build that suggested he still worked out regularly despite his age. He shook my hand firmly, shook Steve's, thanked us for coming all this way. "Things are going to happen quickly," he said, voice calm but carrying an edge of excitement. "I need you set up now." "What exactly are we going to see?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "There's a little girl who haunts the house. She runs around upstairs. If you chase her, she comes downstairs and crosses the lobby here." He pointed to the open space between the staircases, the polished floorboards gleaming faintly under the chandelier light. "Set your camera there. Interval timer, 1 photo every second. I unfolded my tripod, mounted the DSLR, checked the settings carefully. Manual focus, high ISO, wide aperture to catch whatever might move through the dim space. Clay watched closely, but didn't touch anything, didn't even lean in too far. I took a test shot of the empty lobby. He inspected the preview on the screen, nodded approval like a director approving a take. Started up. I set the interval timer. The shutter began its steady click, 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 the sound oddly loud in the quiet house. "I need to get her to come down," he said, and before I could respond, he was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, disappearing from view at the top landing. "This is stupid," I muttered to Steve under my breath. "What do you mean? Aren't you excited?" "There's no ghost. He set this up. He even told me exactly where to put the camera." "Is that her?" Steve asked, turning toward the stairs with mock seriousness. I heard footsteps then, heavy, deliberate, an older man's shoes on hardwood. Clay, obviously, moving around upstairs, probably staging whatever he thought would impress us. "It's him," I said. "I can tell the difference between a man running and a child skipping." Silence followed. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. I was starting to get impatient, ready to call it a night and drive home. Then Clay appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard, face flushed and shiny with sweat. "Did you see her?" I shook my head. He came down slowly, looking defeated in a way that almost made me feel sorry for him. "There's your photo for the article," he said, stepping in front of the camera and letting it snap him once, twice, 3 times before moving aside. I almost laughed out loud. All that buildup, all that money spent renting a mansion for the weekend, and he couldn't even pull off his own trick. I wondered how many times he'd tried this with other people, how many had walked away disappointed or angry. "Can you bring the camera upstairs?" he asked, voice quieter now. "She might be in one of the rooms." I sighed, picked up the tripod, followed him. Steve trailed behind, still amused but starting to look bored. I checked ceilings for projectors, looked for mirrors or glass setups that could create illusions. Nothing obvious jumped out at me. "I saw her in here earlier," Clay said, pointing to a closed door at the end of the upstairs hall. "Set it here." I positioned the camera in the hallway facing the door, left the timer running. Clay pushed the door open slowly. The shutter kept clicking away. The room was empty at first glance, old furniture under dust sheets, heavy curtains drawn against the night. Then I saw it. A small body hung from the rafters. "What the fuck?" I whispered. Steve was already running, feet pounding down the stairs. I heard the front door slam open and shut. I stepped closer, shaking so hard the tripod rattled in my hands. Another body hung beside the first, adult-sized, face bloated and red, eyes bulging. The hands still twitched faintly. I recognized the clothes. The build. It was Clay. I backed out of the room. My legs felt like water. I made it downstairs, out the front door, into the cold night air. Steve was in the car, engine running, pale as death and breathing hard. We drove straight to the nearest police station. I don't remember most of the conversation with the officers. I just kept seeing those bodies, the slow sway from the rafters, the twitching fingers that refused to stop moving. The police took our statements separately. They said Clay had rented the house for the weekend under his real name. No record of any little girl haunting the place. No reports of hauntings in the historical records. They took my camera as evidence. I didn't argue. A week later, they ruled it murder-suicide. Clay had killed his granddaughter, his only living relative, then himself. No sign of anyone else in the house. No evidence of staging or outside involvement. They returned my camera eventually. The memory card was blank. They said it must have been wiped during processing or corrupted somehow. I didn't believe them. I still don't. I know what I saw. I know the camera was running the whole time. I know Clay stepped in front of it downstairs minutes before I found him upstairs, hanging. I haven't posted anything about it on the site. I can't. Not yet. Because if I do, I have to keep my promise. I have to write it honestly. I have to publish the photo he wanted, the one he stepped into frame for downstairs. And I don't know what happens if I break that promise. I don't know what happens if I don't. But every night since then, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I hear the shutter click again. Slow, steady, one photo every second. And I wonder if the lens is pointed at me now, waiting for me to step into frame, waiting for me to keep my word or pay whatever price he set for breaking it. I moved into the apartment 6 months ago because the rent was impossibly low for the area, and the place looked clean and surprisingly well maintained when I toured it on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The landlord, middle-aged guy with a firm handshake that lasted a beat too long and eyes that didn't quite meet mine, practically shoved the keys at me after the walkthrough, saying he needed someone in there fast because the previous tenant had left suddenly without much notice. I didn't press for details. I was 27, fresh out of a breakup that had left me emotionally raw and financially strained, tired of couch surfing with friends who were starting to hint that maybe it was time I found my own place again. The idea of my own space, even a small one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of old carpet, lemon cleaner, and something else I couldn't quite place, felt like a quiet victory. The lease was month to month, utilities included in the rent, no pet deposit required even though I didn't have a pet, and the security deposit was waived if I paid first and last up front. I signed without reading the fine print too closely, too relieved to have a door I could lock behind me and call my own. At first, everything was better than fine. The apartment had good natural light in the mornings from the east-facing windows that overlooked a quiet street lined with mature trees. The fridge kept things cold without making strange humming noises or leaking. The shower pressure was decent for an older building with original plumbing, and the bedroom was big enough for my queen bed, a second-hand dresser, and a small desk where I did freelance graphic design work late into the night when inspiration struck or deadlines loomed. There were a few odd things I noticed right away, but brushed off as normal quirks of an older place that had seen many tenants come and go. A faint, musty smell that drifted through the living room some afternoons, like wet cardboard left in the sun too long or something forgotten in a closet and slowly decaying. One of the kitchen drawers stuck unless you pulled it at just the right angle with a little extra force. The bedroom closet door never quite latched unless you slammed it hard enough to rattle the frame and make the hangers inside clink together. Small stuff. Everyday apartment problems that every renter deals with at some point. I figured I'd get used to them the way you get used to anything when it's your space and you're paying for it month after month. The first week or two passed without anything worth mentioning or worrying about. I unpacked boxes, hung posters on the walls, bought cheap curtains from a discount store to block the streetlight that shone directly into the bedroom at night and made sleep difficult. Then, the little things started happening in ways that were hard to ignore. A coffee mug I'd left on the counter would be in the sink when I came home from work, rinsed but not washed. A book I was halfway through reading would be on a different shelf, spine facing out instead of in like someone had pulled it and put it back carelessly. My keys, always hung on the hook by the door the moment I walked in, would be on the coffee table or the kitchen counter or even the bathroom sink. I told myself I was distracted, stressed from the move and the breakup and the new routine. Maybe sleepwalking or just forgetting where I put things in the haze of exhaustion. I'd never been a great sleeper anyway. Night terrors as a kid that left me waking up screaming, restless legs as an adult that made falling asleep feel like a battle. So it wasn't impossible I was getting up at night and doing things I didn't remember in the morning light. Then the fridge started opening on its own. I'd come home and find it ajar, light on, cold air spilling out into the kitchen and pooling around my feet. Once I found the milk carton tipped over, half-empty puddle on the shelf slowly dripping onto the floor in thick white rivulets. I started taking photos of the fridge interior before I left for work each day, arranging the contents in the same way so I could compare. The photos always showed it closed, contents neat and undisturbed. When I got back, open again, sometimes with something shifted or missing entirely, a yogurt cup gone, a half-eaten sandwich unwrapped and one bite taken. I bought a cheap door sensor from an online retailer that buzzed my phone if the fridge opened. It never triggered. The door would be open when I walked in, sensor silent, battery still full and green. I considered cameras, looked at prices and reviews, balked. Rent was cheap, but I was still paying off student loans and trying to save for a car that didn't sound like it was dying every time I started it in the morning. Cameras felt like overkill for what was probably me being absent-minded or stressed, or maybe even gaslighting myself in some subconscious way. Then the sleep paralysis started in earnest. I'd had it before, once or twice a year since high school, but never like this, never so frequent or so vivid. It used to be simple. Wake up unable to move, chest heavy like someone was sitting on it, room dark, sense of dread but no visuals, no visitors, no faces. I'd wait it out, breathing shallow, until my finger twitched and the spell broke and I could roll over and go back to sleep. Now it happened 2, 3 times a week. And now there was someone in the room with me. He stood at the foot of the bed, bald, pale skin flaking in patches like old paint peeling from a wall, naked, covered in sores that looked like they never healed properly, some scabbed over, some weeping clear fluid, emaciated, ribs sharp under stretched skin, collarbones standing out like broken branches under thin paper. He never moved at first, just stared, eyes dull, almost milky in the dim light from the hallway nightlight, mouth fixed in a wide, clenched grin, yellow teeth showing all the way to the gums. I could smell him, musty, like the living room odor but stronger, closer, mixed with something sour and organic. Sweat, decay, dirt, unwashed skin left too long without soap or water. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, could only watch while he watched me. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, he turned slowly, shuffled back toward the bedroom door with a gait that was careful and deliberate, and slipped out. The paralysis lifted a few seconds later. I'd bolt upright, gasping, heart hammering against my ribs, and run to check the locks. Deadbolts still thrown, chains still on, windows latched from the inside, no one there, no footprints on the carpet, no sign anyone had been inside except the lingering smell that clung to the air like smoke. I named him Jimmy. Giving the thing a stupid, ordinary name made it feel smaller, less real, easier to dismiss as a product of my exhausted mind. I told myself it was just sleep paralysis hallucinations, the brain playing tricks during rematonia, nothing more. I read forums late at night when I couldn't sleep. People see hags, shadow figures, demons sitting on their chests. I saw a naked, homeless-looking man staring at me. It fit the pattern. Nothing special. Just my mind being cruel in a new setting, adjusting to a new space. I started sleeping with the light on, left the bedroom door open so I could see into the living room and the kitchen beyond, kept a baseball bat beside the bed within easy reach. Nothing helped. Jimmy still came, always at the foot of the bed, always staring, always grinning, always silent. The smell lingered after he left, faint but unmistakable, like he'd rubbed himself against the walls and the curtains and the sheets. Then I found the photograph. It was under a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, half hidden like it had been placed there deliberately while I was out running errands. 2 women hugging in front of a waterfall. One looked mid-30s, dark hair, smiling wide and genuine. The other was older, gray streaks in her hair, same smile but softer around the eyes, more tired. I didn't recognize either. I texted Rick, the landlord. Found this photo. Previous tenant leave it? Can I get their contact to return it? He replied within minutes. Rebecca, old tenant. Here's her number. Good luck. I called. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Hello? Hi, this is Flora in 412. I think you left a photo behind. 2 women by a waterfall. Want me to mail it, or… Long pause. Then her voice, low and tight. You need to get out of that apartment, right now. I laughed before I could stop myself. Is this a joke? No, it's not. Things have been going missing, right? Small stuff. Snacks, keys, books moved around. My laugh died in my throat. How do you know that? It happened to us too. My girlfriend, Lena, kept seeing things moved. Then one night she woke up and swore she saw a man standing at the foot of the bed, naked, skinny, covered in sores, just staring. She screamed, woke me up. We searched the whole place, nothing, no forced entry, no one there. We thought she was stressed. Then it kept happening, every few nights. Same man, same stare. We asked around. The tenant before us, guy named Michael, disappeared. No body, no note, just gone. We tried everything, cleansing, salt lines, prayer, nothing worked. We moved, broke the lease, took the hit, but you need to leave before he decides you're not just watching anymore." I hung up. Not because I didn't believe her, because I did. The musty smell was stronger when I put the phone down, like he was in the room with me, listening to every word. I started packing that night. Clothes, laptop, essentials. Told work I had a family emergency. Crashed at a friend's place for 2 nights. Slept like a rock. No paralysis. No Jimmy. Felt safe for the first time in months. The third day I went back to grab the rest of my stuff and take photos for the landlord to prove the place was clean when I left. I walked in. The musty smell was stronger, almost choking, like the apartment had been closed up for weeks instead of days. I ignored it. Started in the living room. Took down the paintings one by one to pack them. Landlord said they were his, but I didn't want to leave anything behind that might give Jimmy a reason to follow. The last one was the waterfall scene, the one I'd found the photo under. I lifted it off the hook. Behind it was a rectangular hole in the drywall, about 2 feet by 2 feet. Rough edges, no insulation visible, just darkness. I shone my phone flashlight inside. Jimmy was there, curled in the space between studs, naked, sores weeping, eyes open, staring, teeth clenched in that same rictus grin. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me. The musty smell poured out, sweat, dirt, unwashed skin, something rotting underneath. He was thin enough to fit in the wall cavity, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around himself. Alive, breathing shallow, watching. I dropped the painting, ran. I called the police from the parking lot, sobbing. Told them there was a man living in the wall. They came, searched, found him, Michael Hansen, missing 6 months, alive, barely, malnourished, dehydrated, covered in bed sores from lying in the same position for weeks at a time. He'd been hiding there since he vanished, eating food from my fridge at night, moving things when I was asleep, watching me sleep, waiting. The police said he'd carved out the space himself over weeks, drywall dust in his hair, tools hidden behind the toilet tank in the downstairs bathroom. He'd been there the whole time I lived there. The smell wasn't a ghost, it was him. The sleep paralysis wasn't hallucinations. It was me waking up while he stood at the foot of the bed. They took him to a hospital, then jail. I moved out the next day, broke the lease, didn't care about the deposit. I still see him sometimes, not in person, in dreams, standing at the foot of my new bed, grinning, waiting. I don't know if he'll ever get out. I don't know if he thinks about me. But I lock every door now, check every closet, look behind every painting, listen for breathing in the walls. Because sometimes the thing haunting your apartment isn't dead. Sometimes it's just waiting for you to leave the room so it can eat your food, move your things, and watch you sleep. And sometimes it's been there longer than you have. I finally agreed to my roommate Sarah's request to hire paranormal investigators. They should be showing up in about an hour or so. I figured writing this out might help me get my head straight before they start setting up equipment and asking questions that'll probably make me feel ridiculous for even letting this happen. I still can't look you in the eye, metaphorically, and say I believe in ghosts, demons, or whatever else she thinks is living with us. All I can say is that I believe in what I've experienced, and now I believe in what Sarah has been experiencing ever since we moved into this house. It's not that I think she's lying or imagining things. It's just that every time something happens, my brain immediately starts looking for the rational explanation first. Creaky floorboards, old pipes, the house settling, carbon monoxide leaks, anything that doesn't require me to accept that something impossible is happening right under our roof. But the incidents keep piling up, and the explanations keep getting thinner, and tonight I'm opening the door to strangers with ghost hunting gear because I'm out of ideas and starting to lose sleep over it. I don't know whether I want them to find something or nothing. Part of me hopes they'll walk through, shrug, say it's all in our heads and let us go back to pretending everything's fine. The other part, the one that's been keeping me awake lately, is afraid they'll confirm what Sarah already believes, and then I'll have to figure out what to do with the fact that I might have been wrong all along. To give you context, here's how we ended up in this situation, because none of it made sense until it started making too much sense. And even now I'm still trying to piece together when the ordinary ended and something else began. Since around the end of November last year, we were desperately looking for places to rent. At the time, I was living with my mom in a house that felt smaller every day, where every conversation felt like it was happening in a room that kept shrinking, and Sarah was crashing with her sister and sister's boyfriend in an apartment that was already too crowded before the boyfriend's dog moved in. These living arrangements were making us both crazy. Constant noise, no privacy, the feeling that we were still kids waiting for permission to live our own lives, and we were determined to start the new year in a new home of our own. Unfortunately for us, it was slim pickings. I later learned it was not an ideal time of the year to go rental hunting, with everyone else trying to move before the holidays or after. But like I said, we were very determined and maybe a little naive about how competitive the market was. After just over a month of searching, houses, duplexes, triplexes, apartments, anything with walls and a roof, we were starting to realize that all we could afford was a shithole in a neighborhood we didn't want to live in. We aren't made of money, but we do have decent jobs and figured we'd be able to afford a nice little house in a safe area with a yard and maybe even a porch. Spoiler, we can't. Or at least we couldn't without giving up groceries or heat. I'm guessing you know where this is going? Yep, we found a house that was too good to be true. I now know why people are willing to look over this tried and true saying. Basically, humans are willing to throw themselves into a new scenario without reassurance as a gamble for a better life. Well, at least that was our reason when we first walked through the door. The home in question is beautiful, small, and wedged between two lovely homes on a street lined with mature trees that make the whole block look like a postcard from the 1950s. At the time, I think I was more willing to just assume it was blind luck rather than blind desperation. There were a few signs that indicated the home might be an issue. For example, the landlord/owner told us that from time to time he would need access to the basement whenever he needed it. I immediately thought this was a red flag until he assured us he would provide us with at least an hour's warning. I'm not too familiar with the laws in my state, but I figured that was normal. The other red flag was when we asked if we could have pets. The landlord told us that pets tend to run away in this area. I told him that we both have owned pets before and would take great care of them. He only repeated what he said and added, "Their little souls would grow tired in such a small home. Besides, the neighbors are interested in keeping the dog and cat population down." I guess I couldn't argue with the last reason, but the way he worded it was odd. After the tour, Sarah's face was beaming with excitement. I knew at that moment we were both ready to sign the lease. The landlord provided us each with an application and told us to fill it out and email it back to him. Sarah and I immediately rushed to the nearest cafe, filled out our applications, and emailed him copies. We stayed for another cup of coffee, since neither of us was interested in going back to our homes. In that short time, we each received an email back from the landlord. He approved us less than 10 minutes after we applied. In retrospect, this probably would have qualified as the third red flag, since he clearly didn't do a background check, but I just assumed we made a good enough impression. As instructed, we waited until January 1st to move in. The first week was incredible. We had a few friends help us with our larger pieces of furniture, but otherwise it was just her and I blasting music and drinking mojitos as we decorated our new house. On the second Saturday at our new place, we decided to host a small housewarming party with a few friends and lots of tequila. We were all having a great time until Sarah came out of the bathroom screaming. She claimed that there was someone behind her when she looked in the mirror. We all stood around her for a while to see if there was more to the story or if she was going to say it was just a prank. It wasn't until she sat down and started to cry that I realized she was serious. As another friend consoled Sarah, me and a few others ran to the bathroom to see who was in our house, which, to no one's surprise, was empty. I love Sarah, but she's afraid of everything. It would be a miracle if I ever convinced her to see a horror movie. She won't even touch a cheesy slasher. I don't mean to judge so much, but she believes in a lot of unconventional healing methods with crystals, and she also looks to her horoscope to determine how she's going to feel that week. Aside from these little quirks, she is clever and really fun to be around. I guess what I'm trying to say is she can be a little too sensitive, which causes her critical thinking to go out the door. After it seemed like Sarah had calmed down, people were starting to have a good time again. I tried talking to Sarah about it, but she was ready to put it behind her. She just shrugged her shoulders and took another shot of tequila. Who am I to judge someone else's coping mechanism anyway? My hangover the next day would suggest I have no other methods. I'd like to say that things calmed down, but I guess I wouldn't be here writing to you if that was the case. Unfortunately for Sarah, the events that took place over the following weeks were cause for concern. Some nights were worse than others. The night after the mysterious man in the bathroom, Sarah was home alone while I was at my parents' house sorting through a few boxes I still had in their garage. When I finally got home, I found Sarah curled up on the couch in the dark. "Sarah?" I called out when I noticed her. "Kate, don't move," she whispered quickly. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what was going on, but the air was thick and I was in no mood to question her request. It must have been less than a minute before Sarah spoke again. "Can you reach the light?" I didn't reply. I just started running my hand against the wall searching for the light switch, but before I could find it, the light came back on like nothing had happened. "Oh, was the electricity out?" I said with relief. "You didn't turn on the light?" she asked. "No." I knew what she meant by her question. "The electricity must have gone out for a moment. It's fine now," I said reassuringly. "Kate, that wasn't the light that was on earlier. I had the living room light off and the kitchen light was on." I could tell by the panic in her voice she was scared. "Before you got home, I was watching TV when I noticed that the light from the kitchen was giving off a very faint and subtle pulsing effect. It wasn't flickering or wearing down like it was dying. It slowly got brighter and ever so slightly became dimmer. Then, without warning, everything shut off." "So, you were just sitting here in the dark until I got home?" I was starting to get really concerned. "No." She turned to face me with tears in her eyes. "It happened like a few seconds before you walked in the door. Didn't you notice the lights shut off?" "I'm sorry. I guess I was distracted." I didn't know what else to say, so I just sat next to her and asked her to tell me everything. "Like I said, I was sitting on the couch and I heard it again, in the basement." She paused. "The basement?" As I said those words, I could feel a chill run down my spine. How could I have forgotten about the basement? I lost my trail of thought as Sarah continued. "I think we should call someone." "Do you think there's someone in the house now?" I started to panic. "No, well, yes and no. I think there's something haunting this house. Maybe we could seek out professionals that investigate paranormal phenomenon." "Paranormal phenomenon? You know, using fancy words isn't going to convince me that it's a legitimate solution." I could tell she was starting to get angry, so I quickly added, "Let me think about it." That was about 2 weeks ago now. The last straw was 3 nights ago when Sarah came running into my room saying she saw someone outside her window. This immediately got my heart pumping because I was afraid someone might be breaking into our house. Even though we live in the US, neither of us own a gun, and it was at that moment that I began to wonder why we didn't. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the next best thing. As I held the knife in my shaking hand, I approached her bedroom window and cautiously peered out. I couldn't really see anything, so I went throughout the house and checked every window and door just to be sure everything was locked. "Okay, I don't see anyone outside, but just to be safe, we should probably sleep in the same room. If someone really is trying to break in, then we should at least try to fight them together." As I told this to Sarah, I realized that my choice of words gave her no comfort. I may not believe in ghosts, but I believed in murderous psychopaths. I added, "Not that there's anyone trying to get in. I just figured we'd both feel better if we kept each other company." "Yeah, that, or it'll be easier for them to find us," she said ominously. I rolled my eyes and went to get my sleeping bag and blankets to set up camp on Sarah's floor. I was relatively comfortable and had no issues falling asleep. However, I remember having vivid nightmares that night. Not because I never have nightmares, but because it was a cyclical nightmare where Sarah would wake me up from my sleep only to see someone in our room ready to kill us. I probably had this reoccurring nightmare about 5 times that night, when I suddenly felt Sarah actually pull my arm to wake up. I was up on my feet quicker than I thought possible, but soon noticed no one else was in the room with us. I began to breathe more normally until I heard someone knock on the bedroom door. I swear I felt my soul leave my body at that moment. I was paralyzed with fear. Who the hell knocks on a door when they're robbing a house? I looked at Sarah, and she was already looking at me with wide eyes. I very slowly started to kneel down to pick up the knife I had laid down next to my sleeping bag. As I lifted the handle, we heard a second knock. I gripped the handle tighter and held it out in front of us, fully expecting someone to burst through, but there was nothing. The silence was somehow worse. I didn't know what to expect. I decided the hell with it. We should just climb out of the window and make a run for it. I grabbed Sarah's arm and motioned that we should go. She agreed and followed me towards the window. I wasn't sure what kind of noise the window would make, but I figured if we hurried, we could be out before the psycho behind the door figures out what we were doing. I reached out towards the window and as quietly as possible, I unlatched the lock. The windows were a bit older, and I was afraid that the multiple coats of paint around the windowsill would cause it to jam. Luckily, the window easily gave way as I opened it. As soon as I was able to get the window wide enough, I shoved the screen off and led Sarah out first. I already had one leg out the window when I heard the door behind me creak open. Maybe a normal person would have just jumped out the window, but the adrenaline got the best of me, and I turned around and threw the knife towards the door. Before I could hear the knife hit the floor, I was already wedging my entire body out the window. "Run! He's in the bedroom!" I yelled. I could see Sarah was already on the phone with police as we began running like hell. I kept looking behind us, checking to see if anyone was following, but I never saw anyone. We made our way down the street and hid behind some bushes in someone's yard. "What did you see?" Sarah asked. I was breathless, partially due to being out of shape and partly because I was scared out of my mind. After a few seconds, I finally answered her. "It was dark, but I think someone was standing in the doorway when I threw the knife. I didn't get a good look." This was partially true. I didn't really see anything, but I had to believe someone was standing in the doorway. Otherwise, how could the door open on its own? "You didn't see anyone, did you?" she whispered. I could tell she wasn't really asking me, but rather archiving this incident in her mind as shit a ghost did. After a few minutes, we saw a cop car approach us on the street. His lights were off, but he was still speeding down urgently towards us. Sarah and I got out of our hiding place and hailed him down. He stopped right next to us. "Are you two okay?" "Yes," we both replied. "Who else is in the house?" His eyes fixated on us with what I can only describe as fear, too. "Only the intruder," I answered. "I don't know how many were in there, but we haven't seen anyone leave." The officer reached for his radio and began to talk as he pulled away towards our house. I found this really strange. Were we just supposed to wait here while he checked out the house? Sarah and I just looked at each other and waited in the freezing cold. Even though we were at the end of our street, we could still see the officer's flashlight as he made his way around the perimeter of the house. Once the officer come back around the other side, he entered the house. Then, not 10 seconds later, we noticed the cop coming around the house again, as if he hadn't just gone into the house moments before. Sarah and I didn't know what to do. "You saw that too, right? He just went into the house and now he's outside again," Sarah said. "Shit, what if that wasn't the cop that went in first? I can't really see, it's too dark. I just assumed he was the one with the flashlight," I said, feeling myself starting to break down. "Oh my God, what do we do? Should we go over there?" Sarah said as she started to walk towards the house. "No, wait!" I yelled. "We might scare the cop and get shot, or worse, the intruder might still be in there." "How is seeing the intruder worse than getting shot?" she argued. Realizing how ridiculous my statement was, we both let out a mild chuckle. After what felt like an eternity, we saw someone leave the house again and get into the cop car. The officer drove down the street towards us. When he approached us, he rolled down the car window. His face was pale and he was sweating. "Ma'am, no one else in the house. I did a double check in every room and I did not see any signs of a break-in." He sort of trailed off for a moment and then added, "There isn't much more I can do. I can drive you back to the house." Wait, we saw who we thought was you entering the house, and then moments later saw a second person enter the house. "There has to be someone else in there," I told him. "Ma'am, please calm down," the officer began before Sarah interrupted him. "Kate, he's a cop, not a priest," she said with such demand I was actually left speechless. Sarah turned to the officer and asked, "Unofficially, what did you see?" The cop, still sweating like it wasn't 30 degrees Fahrenheit out, finally answered, "This isn't the first time we've been dispatched to check out this house. We've received a few calls regarding strange noises and people thinking there was a break-in. We never could find evidence of such activity, though. You two might want to consider living somewhere else." I had nothing else to say. I actually felt like I was going mad. How can my best friend and a cop believe this place is haunted? As promised, the officer gave us a ride back to the house and wished us good luck. Sarah seemed more confident this time around. Without hesitation, she walked into the house and sat down on the couch. I cautiously followed her and sat down next to her. "Want to watch the sunrise with me?" she asked. "Sure," I replied. We stayed on the couch for the rest of the night watching reruns of our favorite sitcom, trying to keep ourselves awake. Initially, it was easy to stay up, but even in this situation where I felt like I could die at any moment, my body was more than willing to give up and sleep. I hadn't noticed that my eyes were closed until I heard Sarah ask if I wanted any coffee. "Yeah, coffee sounds great. Hey, I'm sorry that I didn't believe you before." I realized that my wording made it seem like she has no credibility. "Not because I thought you were crazy. I just can't believe there's ghosts." "Do you still think someone broke into the house?" She seemed more amused by my resistance. "I think there's some sick fuck out there doing this on purpose. That cop was totally unprofessional. You and I both saw a second person walk into the house, remember? I should have believed you were hearing strange noises, because then we might have more evidence on who's trying to scare us, rather than just assume it's a ghost." "Kate." She paused for a moment, then continued. "I know I've brought this up before, but if you agree to have paranormal investigators come into our house and let me finish," she quickly added as I started opening my mouth. "If you agree and they still can't find anything, then I will admit I was wrong and try to find other ways of catching this intruder red-handed. Deal?" The air quotes she used when she said intruder was annoying, but I let it slide. I was too tired to argue any further, so I agreed. This brings me to tonight. I guess I was so resistant about this because the idea of having a room full of people that believed in the paranormal could only further feed into Sarah's fear. I do have one confession before I sign off. I didn't even realize it until I was retelling this story, but neither Sarah or I have been in the basement. The landlord never gave us a tour down there. I know it sounds crazy, but every time it came up, I simply forgot about it seconds later. It's like it didn't really exist. Now, it's all I can think about. I'm actually starting to feel really scared. This is crazy, right? I don't even know if the cop from the other night checked it. I've been doing my best to stay rational the entire time, but even I have to admit, I have no idea what's real anymore. I need to know what's down there. Once the paranormal investigators arrive, I'm going to mention the basement first. I can finally prove to myself there's nothing to worry about. My grandfather was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of terrified people and leave them feeling foolish for ever having been scared in the first place, not because he was cruel or dismissive, but because he had a quiet, methodical way of dismantling fear with facts until there was nothing left to be afraid of. He called himself a debunker, never an investigator. Investigators search for things that might exist. Debunkers prove they don't, and he took that distinction seriously. He spent 40 years quietly taking apart every ghost story, every haunted house claim, every photo of floating orbs or misty figures that crossed his path, always with the same calm patience that made even the most convinced believers start doubting themselves. He knew the mechanics inside and out, how a sloped floor makes a door swing shut when a window's cracked, how nails in drywall eventually give way under the weight of a frame, how low-frequency vibrations from nearby traffic can make people feel watched or nauseous, how cold spots are just drafts from poorly insulated windows or old heating ducts. He'd show up with a flashlight, a tape measure, a digital recorder, and a notebook, and spend an hour or two walking through a place, measuring angles, checking outlets, listening to the house breathe. Some thanked him with tears in their eyes. Some hated him and called him a fraud. He didn't care. He believed people deserved the truth, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. He'd seen too many families torn apart by grief, clinging to hope that the dead could speak, only to be exploited by charlatans who took their money and left them more broken than before. He refused to be one of them. When I was small and woke up screaming about something under the bed or in the closet, I'd call him. He'd drive over at any hour, flashlight already in hand, and walk me through the room step by step, explaining why I had no need to worry. The monster was the furnace kicking on in the basement. The shadow was the streetlight through the blinds. The scratching was a branch against the window that needed trimming. He never mocked me. He never told me I was being silly. He just explained, patient and steady, until the fear drained out of me like water from a tub. He was my safety. When I got older, I started going with him on jobs, weekends in high school, summers in college. I carried the equipment, took notes, learned how to spot the telltale signs of fraud, hidden speakers behind baseboards, fishing line attached to objects, mirrors angled just right to create reflections. He turned it into an internship so I could get credits. I never planned to make it my career, but I loved the time with him. The long drives to houses on the outskirts of town, the way he'd hum old jazz standards while we worked, the stories he told about the early days when he was still figuring out the game, when he'd been fooled once or twice before he learned better. He was patient, methodical, almost gentle when he explained to homeowners why their haunting was just physics or psychology. He never raised his voice, he never gloated, he just wanted the fear to stop. He wouldn't take me on every case. Some were too far, some too late. Some, he said, weren't suitable for a kid, even a college kid. I didn't push. I trusted him. There's one case I still can't decide whether I regret missing or am grateful I wasn't there for. This is the one I need to tell. I didn't know about 19 Fort Wood Lane until after he was gone. I never would have known if he hadn't kept meticulous records of every job, and if this one hadn't been kept separate from the rest, tucked away like he didn't want it seen. I was cleaning out his rented office space last week, trying to drown the grief in paperwork and old equipment, sorting through decades of notes and photos and broken tape recorders, the kind of work that lets you pretend you're doing something useful while your chest feels hollow. About a month ago, his doctor found a mass in his thyroid, cancer, already spread to his brain and lungs. Thyroid cancer is usually treatable when caught early, so this came as a shock. He refused treatment. I thought it was his stubborn pride, his need to go on his own terms, the same stubbornness that made him walk into haunted houses alone when everyone else was too scared. Now I'm not sure. He may have known it was too late. Among the files and folders was an envelope. Plain. Untitled. Tucked in the bottom drawer like it wanted to be overlooked. Everything else was dated, labeled, organized with the precision of a man who believed in order above all else. This one had nothing. That's why I opened it. Inside were a few sheets of lined paper. His handwriting, slanted, half cursive, but shakier than usual, the letters pressed harder into the page like he was trying to force the words out, like the pen was fighting him. 19 Fort Wood Lane. This house should be condemned and left to rot. Not a soul belongs here. It is the work of something I've spent my whole life denying. But I can't deny this. Not anymore. Many have faked it, but there's not a chance in heaven nor hell that this is fraud. I saw things here, things I cannot explain, and this is the place that will get me killed. I know it. I read it again, then a third time. Each pass made it harder to breathe. Gramps had never written like that. Never. He wrote like a scientist, precise, dry, factual. This read like a man who'd seen something that broke him. He continued. Mrs. Penderson called, reporting a figure roaming at night. Husband away for business. New baby. She was scared. I thought intruder. Determined to help. Arrived Friday night. She insisted on staying with me and the baby. Husband confirmed out of state. Location data, testimonies, photos, usual checks. No false doors, no loose windows. Settled in master bedroom. Baby asleep in her arms. We sat up waiting. It came every night, she said. Started as footsteps in hall outside closed door. Pacing, soft, light-footed. Not a man in boots. Strange. She told me it was a man. Noise ceased. Started again. From master bathroom. Mrs. Penderson jumped. I was startled. Bathroom only accessible through door in room we were in. How could footfalls travel from hall to bathroom without passing us? It's starting, she said. Fear in her eyes. Color drained from her face. I assured her I'd catch the bastard. Cruel to terrorize a woman like this. Don't go in there. she said, trembling. I've never looked it dead on. I just know something bad will happen if you antagonize it. I called you to prove I'm not crazy. I don't need you to get rid of it. I'll move. We can go. I just needed you to believe me. Please, let's go. I can't say she didn't warn me. It'll be okay, miss. I promise. I just want to take a look. Whoever's in there can't hurt me. Headed toward bathroom, flung open door, reached for light switch, flipped it. No light. Tried again. Nothing. Backed into bedroom. Tried that switch. Worked fine. Breaker for bath also controlled bedroom. Bulb broken? Walked in. Took a few steps. Rush of air. Door slammed behind me. Mrs. Penderson screamed. Baby cried. Normally fearless, I felt goosebumps. Tremble in my hands. Deep breath. Another step. Stopped by rough force. Stumbled back. Adjusted to dark. Moonlight through slim window above shower. Figure in bathtub. Detached tub. No curtain. No chandelier. No artwork. Shape of a man, but bigger. 8 feet tall. Slim. Top hat? Blood ran cold. No trick. Thing stepped toward me. Reached for throat. Felt weight of hand sinking in. Crushing windpipe. Fought. Struggled. It let go. Walked back to tub. Dissipated. Stumbled through door. Grabbed Mrs. Penderson. Told her we had to go. Didn't look back. Didn't bother with belongings. Helped her into van. Drove off. I don't know what we encountered. But it let me go on purpose. Wants to be known. Wants me to tell people. I spent my life convincing people it didn't exist. Only just that it gets to show me how real it is. It has killed me. Doctors say cancer. I was healthy before that night. Thing reached for throat. Infected me. Planted poison in cells. Left me alive long enough to understand. Fear to fester. Refuse to speak of it. Make sure no one ever goes back. If anyone reads this, know with full intentions and honor that what I experienced was real. Don't ever think we are alone in this world. The pages ended there. No signature. No date. Just those final words hanging in the quiet office. I sat in his chair for a long time, the envelope in my lap, the room silent except for the heater's low hum. I read it again, then a third time. Each pass made it harder to breathe. I kept thinking about the last time I saw him, a few weeks before he died. He'd come to dinner at my place, looked thinner than usual, but still the same Gramps, quiet, steady, cracking the same dry jokes he always did. He didn't mention the house, didn't mention anything unusual. He just sat at the table, ate what I cooked, asked about my work, told me he was proud of me. I didn't know it was the last time. I didn't know he was carrying this inside him. I looked up 19 Fort Wood Lane. The address exists. A house. No public record of hauntings. No news stories. Nothing. But the street is real. The neighborhood is real. I found an old listing photo online. Same house, same trees, same quiet street. It looked ordinary, peaceful. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to see what Gramps had seen. I couldn't. I haven't gone there. I don't know if I ever will. Part of me wants to drive out, walk through the door, see if anything feels wrong, see if the basement is still there, see if Mrs. Penderson still lives nearby, or if she left too. Part of me knows that's the worst thing I could do. Part of me is terrified that if I go, I'll find the same thing he did. Part of me is more terrified that I won't find anything at all. Gramps spent his life proving nothing was there. His last case proved him wrong, and it killed him. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with any of it. I keep the envelope in my desk drawer now. I don't open it anymore. I don't need to. The words are burned into me. Every night I think about that house, about the figure in the bathtub, about the way Gramps described the hand reaching for his throat. I think about how he wrote, "It let me go on purpose." I think about how he died a few weeks later, and how the doctors called it cancer, and how I used to believe them. Now I'm not sure what I believe. I just know that whatever was in that house is still out there somewhere, and it knows my grandfather tried to prove it wrong.